Start the recording. Hey, welcome to everyone. My name is Dr. Stephanie Barra. I'm faculty at UAA. This is the 16th annual UAA Undergraduate Philosophy Conference. Our keynote speaker began the conference last week on Thursday, and we are pleased to begin Monday's graduate presentations. Some rules of etiquette first. Before we begin Dr. Jennifer McCurdy's presentation, first of all, feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. And if, of course, you can go to participants or to reactions, and we will have time for a Q&A at the end. Also, feel free to stay muted if you're not presenting. Well, our conference begins with Dr. Jennifer McCurdy's presentation. Dr. McCurdy is our UAA multiculturalism postdoc, and she has a degree in religious studies with an emphasis really in thinking about indigenous worldviews and faiths, and received her PhD in religious studies from the University of Denver, part of their School of Theology. I would like to welcome Dr. McCurdy today, and I will do my very best magic here and pin your screen so everyone can fully see your presentation. Thank you very much. Welcome, Dr. McCurdy.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share this, but let me know what you're seeing. I think I'm showing you the actual presentation.
Looks like you are starting.
Okay. Well, good. Let me expand this. And I don't mind questions. The other piece is this is something I've been working on for a while now, but I'm always open for your feedback, your criticism, your critique, or anything you want to call it. So having said that, thank you, Stephanie. And what I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit so Dr. Sundstrom, if you saw him last week, he started out talking about giving sort of an ontology of race or racism. And so my first couple of slides are going to build off of his idea of what racism is, but I'm actually going to be talking today about anti-colonial theory and in a way that it applies to bioethics. So I'm actually putting a lot of random interdisciplinary things together. And so I'll be doing some defining before I get into the case study. But I'm calling this being human is more than a calculus. In bioethics and in healthcare and in society, we do a lot based on utilitarian calculation. And so what you'll see is that as I get into this talk a little bit more, I am actually using an anti-colonial theorist named Sylvia Wynter to push back on that idea of utility and the calculus for people of color. So let's see. So this is a slide just showing what Dr. Sundstrom had talked about last week. And this is how he looked at racism. So if you look at the orange, that's one section. And if you look at the purple, that's another section. But basically, he said racism is made out of this agential piece and then a non-agential piece. So basically, if you put this in a nutshell, it's the interpersonal racism that we normally think of when we think of racism. And then there's the structural racism, which is the non-agential that occurs for whatever reason. And he went into detail about what causes structural racism. But the sort of racism that exists just within the policies and the law and our procedures and our institutions and things like that. So I want to reframe this in a little bit more about the way I think about racism. So I actually think of the big title, the big heading as the Euro-Christian worldview, and I'll define that in a minute. But I don't think racism is where we should be spending our time. I don't think we should be trying to solve racism as a society. I think if we want to deal with issues of racism, we have to deal with the Euro-Christian worldview and with this idea of colonialism. And so I'm going to actually move this over if I can. I don't think I can. I'm not looking at you all though. So I've got two screens. It's messing things up a little bit. So basically the Euro-Christian worldview is the big picture in my idea. And under that are the colonial constructs of race. So racism is actually a product of colonialism, and colonialism was there. I mean, racism is there to serve colonial systems. So if we look at this from a larger view, a 500-year-old view and a much larger systemic view, we would actually need to really think about this idea of colonialism and the worldview that Westerners have in order to start dealing with understanding what racism is and learning how to deal with the effects of racism. So I talk about something called the colonial racial discourse, meaning that you can't have one without the other. And in fact, racism is just a tool of colonialism. And these are a couple of quotes that I think are pretty impactful to get your head around that. Annabel Quijano is really the father of anti-colonial or post-colonial thinking. And he says race is the most efficient instrument of social domination invented in the last 500 years. So he's calling it a tool. And then Thomas McCarthy writes, 5 centuries of imperialism and racism did not disappear without a trace, just 50 years since the post-war successes of decolonization and the civil rights struggles. So it's continuous. It's not something that happened in the past. It's something that continues to happen. And decolonization is also continuing to happen alongside colonialism, or we could call it neo-colonialism, or there's other neo-imperialism. And Patrick Wolf also talks about settler colonialism, which is what the United States is. It's a settler colonial state where colonists come and stay. And he said colonialism has lasting implications. It's not an event. It's not like colonialism happened. It's a structure. And so it continues to happen. It's within our mindset and it's within our structures. So let's talk about this idea of Euro-Christian worldview. A worldview is something, the term worldview is used in a lot of different ways. And I'm not saying it's just an ideology or a philosophy on life. I'm looking at worldview from specifically the scholar Mark Freeland's definition. And he is an Indigenous scholar living in South Dakota, teaching in South Dakota right now. But he calls worldview an interrelated set of cultural logics that fundamentally orient a culture to space, time, the rest of life, and provides a prescription for relating to that life. And so worldview is actually something that we start to gain early on in our development, the development of our cognitive brain. And it's not something, it's something that we're almost born into and taught into. And it's highly internalized in this definition of worldview. And so it's really hard to recognize. It's often perceived as just our idea of what reality is. But the way we perceive reality, somebody else might have a worldview that perceives reality very differently. And one of the ways, usually the best way to be able to see your own view is to be able to understand, or at least to hear about somebody else's worldview. And we can think of Indigenous worldviews that way. They are very different than Euro-Christian worldviews. But I'm not going to go into that too much because I want to have time to get to the case study. So This idea, though, of a Euro-Christian worldview has very specific logics. And these are things that we as Westerners tend to take for granted. And it's conceptions of time. We have a very linear conception of time, that we're going in a certain direction, whether that's religious or secular. We arrange things along hierarchies. We're individualistic. We also have this universalize tendency. Instead of saying that this is how I feel in this space and context and this time, we as Westerners tend to universalize things. We like big theories. And there's this very deep-rooted prioritization over progress. We think progress is good, undeniably good. And oftentimes we prioritize science over lived experience, over stories, mythologies, things like that. And the last piece of this, of course, is economics. The Euro-Christian logics really are driven by profit and economics and this idea of scarcity, the scarcity mentality. So when I'm going to be talking about the Euro-Christian worldview in conjunction with the medical ethics, bioethics case in just a minute. So we're going to be going through these are just a few ways of thinking about the Euro-Christian worldview. It's much, much more complex than this, but I had to pull some pieces out of this in order to make some points about the case. So the Euro-Christian worldview is inherently hierarchical, universalizing. It prioritizes science, progress, and profit. And of course, these are wide generalizations, and there can be a lot of variations between the way different individuals think and different individuals within a specific society. But I can easily say that we're all affected by these in some ways or another. So I'm going to be taking two perspectives on the case: a colonial perspective, or a Euro-Christian worldview perspective, and an anti-colonial perspective. And so what is anti-colonialism? Well, George Day and Meredith Lorden define anti-colonialism as the resistance to white supremacy and Eurocentric cultural organization that looks for possibilities of resisting and transforming cultural systems of oppression and domination, or imposed ways of knowing, being, and living. So there's two sides to this idea of anti-colonialism. One is the resistance of Western or Euro-Christian structures. And the other is not just resisting, but also transforming structures based on one's own cultural systems and one's own epistemologies and one's own worldviews. And so oftentimes I think of this as white people or people that are Euro-Christian that think this way. And again, this is, we could get into the definitions of what it means to be white and what it means to be a person of color, and what, how we all are Euro-Christian in some way or another. None of us have not been affected by a lot of these structures. But in general, let's use indigenous cultures, an indigenous culture for an example. The dominating culture cannot necessarily do the second part of the decolonization. They cannot transform their cultural systems because you're not part of that cultural system. You're not part of an indigenous cultural system. So you can't actually do that transforming piece. But we can, as Westerners, we can resist some of the pieces of Euro-Christian thinking and colonial structures that exist. So I want to shift to bioethics because we're going to be delving into a bioethics case in order to illustrate this idea of Euro-Christian worldview and anti-colonial worldview. And I will say there's not one anti-colonial worldview. It's not like we're going to switch out colonial for a specific anti-colonial narrative, because that would also be universalizing. I'm going to use one specific anti-colonial narrative. There can be many, many, many. I'm going to just be using one, and her name is Sylvia Winter, and she's a Jamaican scholar, but I'll talk about her in a minute. But in order to do this, let's talk a little bit about bioethics. And so one of the things that bioethics struggles with, the field of bioethics, as does every institution in the United States, is how do you deal with racism? And so Olivet Burton, who's a bioethicist and a public health scholar, she said, bioethics cannot figure out what to do with race until it understands the historical, cultural, and religious basis for current race relations. Well, what I think is the historical, cultural, and religious basis for race relations is colonialism and the Euro-Christian worldview. And just these pictures here, in case you don't know, this is just one example of something that we've been seeing a lot in the news in the last few years. But in the 1800s, there were medical experiments that were performed on enslaved women and their babies by a man named Dr. Marion Sims, who has been credited as the founder of modern gynecology. And he had a statue that was up in New York City and has been highly regarded. Well, he had actually been performing surgeries on his own enslaved women, females, without any anesthesia. There was at least 4 of the women who he had done experiments on and done gynecological experiments on, probably around 50 or 60 procedures in all without anesthesia. And he ended up using he used these women to learn how to do these procedures. And then when he began to do the procedures on white women, he started using anesthesia. And one of the other things he did was he tried to find cures for tetanus by using these women's babies and prying open their skulls to try to understand what was going on in their brains or their heads to see if he could find a cure for tetanus. So this was a man that was the founder of modern gynecology, who had been doing these experiments on women, on Black women. And so something that we could talk about as historical, these sorts of things carry on into the future. And the fact that this statue was standing in New York City just a few years ago still says something about how much we don't know about the historical, cultural, and religious background of our own medical system, of our own society. But there's a lot. The second picture here shows that there's been a lot of attention that has been brought to this history. And now what do we do about that history? And so I think critical race studies and anti-colonial theory, post-colonial theory can really lend us that lens of how racism happens within a larger context of history and society. So this is just one of the kinds of things that bioethics needs to be more aware of. And you could probably find, in medicine, you're going to have more egregious sorts of things like this than you're going to have in some of the other industries that aren't going to have human subjects, involved. But other recent manifestations of racism, which we could also draw conclusions about the colonial past, are the disparities in COVID cases and the vaccination rates. Those are still because of the inequalities that have happened over the throughout the colonial period and into the modern and postmodern periods. The police protecting people's property. This idea of property is a colonial concept. Racialized groups being the ones having to take the high-risk jobs during COVID, but most likely not having the best healthcare coverage. All of these things we can put into a colonial framework. So we're not just stuck on this idea of racism and skin color, that there's actually a greater context. And what I'll say is that if we just keep trying to get rid of racism, we're not going to get very far, because we have to deal with the context around why racism started and why it continues. So let's move on. Stephanie, how much time do I have? Until what time?
Okay, so it's 3:20 now. Maybe 15 more minutes?
Okay. Okay,
Yeah,
so let's get to the case.
We have until 4.
Until 4, okay. So here's the case that I'm going to use, and a lot of you may have heard this case before, but her name's Jahai McMath. She was 13 years old. She'd gone in to get a tonsillectomy at Oakland Children's Hospital. She had been having a lot of sleep apnea, and she was embarrassed to go spend the night at her girlfriend's houses for parties, and because she had this snoring and she didn't want to be made fun of. And her mom said, you know, let's fix this problem. I'll take you in and we'll fix that. We'll get some surgery. So she came out of surgery and she seemed to be doing okay. She was awake and began to have some bleeding. And her mother and her grandmother kept saying, something's wrong. This seems like a lot of bleeding. And the nurse said, well, sometimes this happens that they bleed a little bit after surgery, and they didn't do anything about it. And eventually the bleeding continued to grow, to get worse. And the surgeon was called, but decided it wasn't important enough to come in. Well, after hours of bleeding, she cardiac arrested and was resuscitated. And it was a long resuscitation, but they were able to get her heartbeat back. They put her on a ventilator, and after around 2 days, they did an exam, and she was considered what's called brain dead. And this idea that someone has there's a list of criteria, a list of tests that are done to determine whether or not someone's brain dead. And it's a very specific list of criteria. And so she was diagnosed as brain dead, but she's still on a ventilator. So the machines are breathing for her, and her heart's still beating, her body's warm. And so it's this kind of strange thing that you're considered brain dead. And so if you're considered brain dead in the eyes of the law in the United States, you're considered dead. And so there's no reason to keep you on life support if you're dead. But it's a really hard thing for families to get their heads around, that someone is on a ventilator, their heart's beating, their chest is going up and down from the rhythm of the machines, and they're warm. Their skin's warm to the touch. And so this is an interesting case because there wasn't a lot of precedent for this at the time. And usually if somebody's diagnosed as brain dead, they are taken off life support, and you don't even need, as a physician, you don't need the family's what's the word I'm thinking? If you don't need the family's okay to withdraw them from life support. Even if you had a small amount of brain activity based on these tests, it's all up to the families to decide whether they want to leave their families on life support or not. But in this case, if you're considered brain dead, legally and clinically brain dead, there's nothing the families can do. Well, Jahai McMath's mom, Nalia, she said, okay, first of all, basically she's thinking it was your negligence that caused my daughter to be in this state. And I don't believe she's dead. You're telling me she's dead, but she doesn't look dead to me. And I don't want you to take her off the life support. So she got a lawyer, and she fought this idea of brain death, which was at this time pretty much unheard of. And the lawyer actually was able to keep Jahai on life support until they were able to transfer her to New Jersey. New Jersey is the only state that has a legal exception to brain death, that families can contest this idea of brain death. So she was transferred to New Jersey, and then Jahai ended up living on the ventilator for 4 more years. And this was unheard of. Doctors thought that she would just, her body would just break down and she wouldn't live very long on a ventilator. She lived for 4 years. And there is some question about whether she truly was completely brain dead from the clinical standpoint. And even brain death is contested. This idea of brain death is contested, but it's legally, it's legally accepted, but it's still contested in the literature and among bioethicists. So this is the case. And so a couple of things that I want, let's see. So let's move on to the analysis of this case. So I'm not actually going to use Peter Singer, but I think Peter Singer is a really good representation of a bioethicist who comes from this Euro-Christian worldview that mirrors the way medicine is practiced, at least in the context of brain death. So he's a secular, he has a secular utilitarian perspective, and he's an Australian moral philosopher. He teaches at Princeton University, and he does a lot of work now on altruism, but a lot of his early work was about defining death, defining personhood, defining, like, when can you use one person's organs for the benefit of another, and this idea of utility. And he's also known for saying that there are some animals who have more personhood than some humans. So, you know, he's very controversial in his early years. I don't think some of the stuff he's doing around altruism now, I don't think is as controversial. And I think he's trying to separate himself from his past, but it's going to continue to haunt him because I'm using him in this. But I would say that he does represent a Euro-Christian worldview in terms of these sort of issues of life and death and how they've actually come to be in the medical world. Sylvia Wynter is who I'm going to be engaging with as one anti-colonial worldview. She considers herself a post-humanist. She's anti-colonial. She was actually born in Cuba. She grew up in Jamaica in the 1940s. And so she actually is a product of the anti-colonial protest movements in Jamaica in the 1940s, when Jamaica wanted to get rid of Great Britain as their colonizer and gain independence. I think she's around 90 or 95 years old now, but she's got a long history in studying physics, neurobiology, film, music, economics. She's written many other things, and she's written many texts, plays. She's a playwright, essays, and all kinds of different things. But I mostly engage with her essays. So these are sort of two ways to think of a Euro-Christian response and an anti-colonial response. And I'll be talking a lot more about Sylvia Wynter. So so let's look at this idea of the hierarchy. I'm going to go back to those four points that I made about what is a Euro-Christian worldview. And hierarchical thinking is one way that Euro-Christians, I include myself in that, the way we think. And it's just the way we're programmed. And so if you look at this idea of a hierarchy, people of color throughout the last 500 years have been relegated to different categories, and not just people of color, but, you know, different groups of people. But right now we're talking about racism. And so these categories have always been in opposition to the dominant category, but either you are a Christian or you're an enemy of Christ. You're rational, you know, or you're irrational. You're or other things that have been used to describe this sort of othering. People are degenerate, they're savages, superstitious. And so some of these things, we don't really hear people running around now saying, oh, you're an enemy of Christ. You know, we don't use the same words, but but the sort of the structure is very similar. So we might not even be calling people degenerates or savages anymore, but we might in healthcare be thinking, oh, well, they're just superstitious. They don't understand science. They're irrational. We do still hear those kinds of words. So, and just thinking about Euro-Christian worldview and this idea of hierarchy, there's always been and still is a hierarchy of of people, how people have been hierarchicalized, if that's a word. And one of the things that happens when we do that is we devalue an entire group of people's beliefs. Keldon, I don't know if it's a word, but thanks for laughing at me. But the people's beliefs are devalued, their worldviews are devalued because they're not scientific, or they're not scientific enough, or they're not, they don't maybe seem rational enough. And so if we look at Jahai McMath, we still see this today through explicit devaluation of, you don't really know what you're talking about. This is the way science is. And the rules are that if you're brain dead, you're brain dead. So you could be irrational because you're not, let's put it this way. I've been in healthcare and I've been at the bedside of many of these kinds of cases. And these sorts of things are sometimes explicit or sometimes implicit. But this idea that people who don't buy into the science and don't buy into the idea that, we're telling you she's dead. There's this idea that the other is irrational or is and somehow inferior. So implicit bias and explicit devaluation, I would argue, have happened in the Jahai McMath case on multiple levels. One of the things that in an interview of her mother, she said, I just felt like nobody was listening to us. We were saying there's something wrong, the bleeding. I know my daughter, this isn't right. This is a lot of bleeding. And she said, if I feel in my heart that if this had been a little white girl, that something would have been done sooner. And she said, I can't prove it, but I just felt like nobody was listening to us. And that could be a reflection of this idea of devaluing her concerns, her intelligence, her beliefs. Another piece of this hierarchy is that, I don't know if you've heard this before, but there's this idea of social death or sort of a symbolic death. And there's a lot of talk in literature, in critical race literature and things like that, about how people of color or people who've been othered by the dominant culture are socially dead. So it kind of also goes back to those binaries about rational, irrational, your scientific or your mythological, superstitious, religious. And in a lot of ways, those things create this social death for you. You don't necessarily fit into the master narrative. And so we could say that Jai was already, she had this social death in the eyes of people that were caring for her. And I'm not saying that this is all very general. I'm not saying that individual nurses or doctors considered her to be socially dead, but this is more of an implicit framework that comes with this Euro-Christian worldview. Now here, Sylvia Winters really spent a lot of time saying, you know what, man has, at the capital M, has always been at the top of this hierarchy. And man is not necessarily indicative of the human, but has been historically that man has always been on the top of the hierarchy. So she wants to flip the narrative and say, you know what, it's those people that are living in these liminal spaces, people who are the socially dead, who need to be the ones speaking. We need to flip that narrative and start listening to the people, and the people that are in the liminal spaces need to be the ones talking, need to be the ones leading. How do we flip that narrative? And what she would do, if we were actually looking at, if we were doing an ethical consult on Jahai McMath from a Wintarian perspective rather than a Euro-Christian perspective, we would be looking for ways to listen to Jahai and her family and what do they want? What do they need? What are their beliefs? What is their ontology? What is their worldview? How do they situate themselves in the world? And what this would do is free Jahai and her family from this idea of a social death. They would no longer be on the inferior side of this binary. And also, if there had been people listening, maybe Jahai might not have even had a cardiac arrest in the first place. Or even if she had, maybe if we were listening, her mother, Nyla, could have refused the brain death exam and not have had to hire a lawyer and fight for the fact that she thought her daughter was still alive and that she still considered her daughter to still be alive. So I probably only have about 5 minutes?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. So I probably won't have time to go through all of these, but we could look at universality in these same sorts of ways. So the Euro-Christian idea, we codify all of our beliefs and our worldviews in our policies and our laws and rules, maybe unwritten rules, and a lot of these policies are made by, again, the dominant world, people that are in the dominant worldview, people are in positions of power. And this Euro-Christian worldview is tied to a history of violence and oppression. And so why would anything necessarily change if the people that are still in power are those with the Euro-Christian worldview, and that Euro-Christian worldview is intimately tied to this history of violence and oppression? Maybe it's not so much outright violence anymore, but we still see a lot of oppression. And Jahai's family, and the community they're from, they didn't have any say in what it means to be dead. Who defined this? And I can tell you, it was a Harvard brain death group in 1968 that first defined brain death. But I don't believe Jahai's community was at the table when those decisions were being made. In fact, it was a group of white male physicians that made those decisions about how to define death. And so also Jahai's family didn't have any choice in the face of this law that and this practice of brain death. They didn't have any choice. This is the law, you have no choice. And so they ended up having to fight against the system to keep their daughter on life support. And again, I'm not saying that I think we should be keeping people who are severely neurologically devastated on life support at all costs. But what I'm saying is there's a lot of things that could have been done to make this situation much better for them. Winter, on the other hand, would say there's many worldviews, and these worldviews come from our stories, the stories that we've learned, the worldviews that we've grown up within, and that Jahai's family values should have been considered within their own context, their own worldviews. And policies and rules should be written so that they do consider different ethno-knowledges, different people's knowledges. The third one is this idea of science and how science always often trumps lived experience. So death and personhood have always been defined from a biological standpoint, but not from a communal or a mythological standpoint or a familial standpoint. And so this idea, if you're a person, you're a part of the moral society, you're a member of the moral society. But if you're considered a non-person, you might still be human based on your genetics. But if you're considered a non-person, you no longer have any rights as a member of the society, as a moral member of society. And then bodies, once this has been determined, your body becomes a utilitarian resource, whether that is for an organ donor, or as an economic bargaining tool for saving hospitals money or saving society money. And the fact that Jahai was considered a corpse, and people even were saying she was a corpse, reflects that she was no longer considered a person, even though her mother said she's absolutely a person, she's my daughter. And so can personhood also be considered a familial thing where she's not maybe as an individual a person, and she can no longer make decisions and be an agent in and of herself, but she's still part of a family. She still is considered a person in other people's eyes, in the community's eye, her community's eyes. And so, what are Jahai's family stories? And that all makes up, the stories affect the meanings that we give to our loved ones. And so is there also a history of racial trauma, of enslavement within the McMath family that also discerns what they think is considered to be a moral member of society, and do certain privileges and those sorts of things. So I think this is the main point I want to make is on the slide, is that we always want to blame the people who are resisting progress. And yet maybe the progress is the actual problem in and of itself. Instead of the people who are disagreeing with a lot of these things that are happening, or trying to resist Western constructions, why aren't we turning our focus back on the idea of progress in and of itself? The idea of progress, while there might be some positive things that come out of it, there are a lot of things that are coming out of it that are very oppressive to certain groups of people that don't necessarily believe in the same way. And then the last piece of this is economic, and this is sort of the central piece. Economics was always the driver for slavery, for colonialism, and this idea of medical ethic justice always tends to be defined through this distributive lens, never through, and often through utilitarianism, which Peter Singer is one of, but through reparations or reparative justice, or any kind of racial justice, or there's many other types of justice, but bioethics considers sort of distributive justice pretty much the main source of justice. And so economics is often used as a trump card to deny equitable services. We can even see this in, dare I say, in the academic areas, that oftentimes it's the things that are the equitable services that get cut for the sort of the utilitarian, the need of the many. And so for Jahai, life support is just considered, quote, too expensive for the hospital or for society. That's something you hear a lot. Actually said, he said this in an interview, they think she is just some Black lady sucking down resources. And so this idea of being human is more than a calculus. Winter would say, we are homo economicus now. We're no longer homo politicus. We're not homo religiosus, we're homo economicus, where our economics is our new priesthood, and that everything we do is around economics. And utilitarian calculations, she would say, very, very, very rarely favor reparative justice. And so she really thinks that we should be putting human needs before economic growth. And how do you do that? That's not something for me to answer, but can we shift from homo economicus to this idea of homo narrans, which is listening to people's stories, understanding people's lived experiences, understanding that there's diversity there, and start to think about people over profits. So there's a picture of Jahai, and what I want to just say is, based on structural inequities and colonialism, Jahai's death and the poor treatment of her family were avoidable, unfair, unjust as a result of healthcare inequities related to the implicit Euro-Christian colonial worldview of bioethics. That's my final point.
Thank you, Dr. McCurdy.
Thank you.
Let's see. We have a few minutes for questions, about 15 minutes for questions. And I believe there was a hand raised during the lecture as well.
Juanita.
Yes. Dr. McCurdy, do you feel comfortable calling on those who raise their hands yourself, or would you like me to field questions?
Do it. I do, but I think I need to have a different view. Let me do gallery view. Okay, now I can see everybody.
Okay, very good, very good. Yes, anyone want to start out with an initial question?
I take critiques too. I think that there's always more learning to be done, and there's an interdisciplinary group here. So
I just had a clarification question. I think Jahai's parents and herself, they were Christian, right?
I believe so. Mm-hmm.
So were they just not Christian enough?
Not Christian enough.
I guess I'm just curious about the story about the implicit, sort of connection to colonialism, the Euro-Christian colonialism that you mentioned, and why not just focus on the commodifying effects, right, of different forms of systems, including the medical system?
Instead of are you asking why I'm using the term Christian in Euro-Christian? Ways or?
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure, because I mean, the strongest part of your discussion, it seemed to me, was the sort of the economic piece.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm trying to figure out the tie-in to the Euro-Christian perspective, especially if Jahai's family was Christian, and yeah.
Right. So the idea of being Christian in and of itself isn't necessarily what I mean about Euro-Christian. So you can be an atheist and you can be a Euro-Christian. You can be American, not European, and be a Euro-Christian. So the term Euro-Christian comes from the historical origins of a lot of the ideas that culminate in the traits of individuality, universality, a sort of a capitalistic economy. All of these things happened over the span of 500 years, beginning with Christendom. And I would say being Christian in and of itself, or believing in Christ, isn't necessarily what I mean. It's the idea of Christendom. So the marriage of the political and the Christian Portuguese and Spanish leaders early on. Colonialism was spearheaded by Christendom, by popes, and by the edicts of popes. And we have a lot of laws. We have laws on the books today around land that still are based in Christendom, in things that were put forth in the doctrine of discovery and those edicts. So the doctrine of discovery was Christian driven, and it's the basis of our society today. So you may not be Christian, you might consider yourself Christian, and you still might be very much Euro-Christian in this way. You also might be Christian, but you might be less Euro-Christian. So, this is not my expertise, but I think that there are some anti-colonial or some sort of decolonial perspectives that Black churches have that come from Africa. And so being Christian has so many different flavors that it's hard to, it's hard to qualify that, but. And Jahai McMath and her family probably also, they're a part of a Euro-Christian society. So they have that same, they'll have a lot of that same kind of framework.
Thanks.
Thanks for asking.
Keldon.
I've seen some interesting articles about unequal opiate prescriptions for Hispanics and African American people. And I can't help but think that this seems to be kind of related to potentially the reason they feel they were denied treatment. And I'm wondering what some other options, or maybe the way that other countries look at a criteria for what makes someone brain dead or when they're pulled off life support might be.
So the idea of psychoactive drugs or opiates, those sorts of things, there's a long history of in our country of believing that people of color they have higher pain thresholds. And that actually still happens today. There's been studies that have shown that people of color receive less pain medication than white people in general. And in fact, there was a Black female physician who was working with COVID patients, and this was just recently, obviously. And she recorded herself laying in bed, dying from COVID. She did die, but she said her doctors, she'd had some neck surgeries and she had some other things going on. She was an older woman. And she said her doctors, even as she was dying of COVID, even though she was also a physician, she was being denied pain medications. And there's still this vestigial idea that Black people are either drug seekers or they have higher pain thresholds. And this isn't something this is historical, and so the Marion Sims cases that I told you about, probably, I'm guessing he also thought that these women had higher pain thresholds and he could operate on them without anesthesia. So, these things, this idea that colonialism is a structure, not an event, it is a structure and it's a continuing structure. As far as other options, there are other people in the bioethics literature who have written about this too, but that people should be able to make their own decisions about whether they even want their loved one to get a brain death exam, because if they never get tested, you can't be forced into withdrawing life support. So I told you that New Jersey is the only state that allows these religious exemptions or philosophical exemptions from the idea of brain death, and they've had very few cases of this actually happening. So it's not that the economic burden on hospitals or on states would be enormous if people did decide to say, I don't believe that my loved one is dead. I just, that's not my religion. That's not my belief. That's not my worldview. It still gives that space without forcing people, which in fact can be very traumatic. You're basically, if somebody believes their loved one's alive and you kill them, you take them off the ventilator, that's extremely traumatic. It doesn't matter what we believe, it matters what they believe. So I think leaving that open for some people, I don't think most people in that situation would choose to continue life support. They would want some sort of quality of life for their loved one, but that doesn't preclude the fact that some people don't believe that, or they don't think that. And this is a little bit more of an extreme case. Would I want that for my loved one? No, I wouldn't keep them on life support, but I have a different worldview. I have a different belief system. And I trust the medical system. I trust white people more than Jahai McMath's mother may have trusted the white medical system, in general. So there's a lot of things that go into that. But I think giving people more choice to be able to freely express their own values that come from their own worldviews is important. Kilden.
I think that's the
applause. That was applause.
Oh, that's a clap. Okay.
I have a quick question. Maybe not that quick.
Yes.
In the Jahai McMath's case, there were medical professionals that were caring for her that later testified that they felt enormous moral distress in continuing to treat her, even though she was not still alive from their point of view. Even though we're not often in such an extreme case, it does appear that every now and then there are conflicts between patients, families, and medical professionals on treatment, whether it be amputation of a leg or removing someone from life-sustaining treatment. You don't see that all the time, but these conflicts do exist. And there are some people, how would you respond to those that say, there's no doubt that there are differences of perspective here. There is racism in healthcare, and we can document that in a variety of ways. But the way to move forward is to make sure that we're talking to one another and we have a common frame of reference. Oftentimes we think science is that frame of reference, but I think some people would argue focusing on these really different incommensurable worldviews is kind of the opposite direction that we need to go in medicine, where we need to find a common language and a common unit that we want to talk about. And after all, for example, with respect to brain death, now everyone is thinking about what are the criteria of brain death, right, afterwards. But maybe that's exactly the direction that we need to go in, and make sure that we show proper respect. But to kind of say, okay, religion and these other kinds of cultural perspectives, those are diverse, but let's have some common values when it comes to medicine and patient best interests so we can solve these disagreements. Is that too abstract? Like focusing on these issues might be going in the wrong direction.
So I think that, so there are a lot of incommensurable values that occur between groups of people, and especially around a lot of bioethical issues. And I'm not saying, I think one of the things that, if we look at bioethics in general, the focus has always been on trying to find common ground, trying to find common values. And very rarely do we talk about focusing on the differences. And I think one of the things that we could do better is start to focus on differences. And they may be incommensurable, but how do we create a wider space to allow those differences to occur when, especially when they are continuing in some ways this maybe an oppression, it could be epistemological devaluation, or it could be physical violence. I mean, we could say that Jahai McMath, if she had been taken off the ventilator in front of her mom and allowed to die without her permission, that would be in some ways physically violent. And so the perspective of Jahai McMath is very different. And to judge her perspective based on our understanding of science is, this idea of brain death is tidy because either you are or you're not, and it makes it easier for healthcare providers. And I've heard a lot of healthcare providers saying things like, well, you're either dead or you're not, you know, like we don't have time to mess around with this stuff. And pragmatically, that's true. But if we don't consider other worldviews or other people's perspectives, then we will continue to lump everybody under a Euro-Christian worldview, under these same sorts of structures that will continue to racialize and continue to marginalize. And so we have to think about what the differences are of these incommensurable, these incommensurable differences, rather than just always focusing on the 4 principles. Well, we all believe in justice, equity. I mean, we all believe in, non-maleficence, beneficence, justice, and autonomy, but how we define those, and there are other values too, can be very, very different. And so even just the focus in bioethics on distributive justice is so narrow, because distributive justice usually is utilitarianism, and it usually leaves out, again, the people that have been historically oppressed. So, for instance, with the COVID vaccine, there are a lot of people that were, you included, Stephanie, working on this idea of how do we deal with limited resources like ventilators. And there's this idea that, well, we just give everybody equally, or first come, first serve. But that still doesn't address the issues of the people who are already oppressed. First come, first serve still keeps the playing field the way it is. It doesn't ever change the playing field. So utilitarianism, this idea that we're all a unit and that we're all equal, sounds great, but the fact is we're not all equal. And so this is just pushing back on, I mean, it sounds radical, and it sounds radical to me even. It sounds radical in a bioethics perspective. And I know that most physicians would yell at me for saying these things, but we have to start looking at the differences. And I'm not saying that I have any idea about how this, the one thing we could do is all states could adopt New Jersey's exceptions to the rule legally. And so that is one way we could take care of this one specific situation, but the implicit bias is another whole issue. So I don't know if that helps, Stephanie.
Yeah, absolutely. It's at least, it's a place to start. Hey,
Place to start.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCurdy.
Thank you.
Interesting talk.
Thanks, Joel.
It is 4:02 by my clock. We got Scott. Bravo, bravo. Interesting. We've got a number of other of additional fascinating talks upcoming. UAA students presenting some of their work especially written for Dr. Potter's Mind and Machines class. Philosophy of mind is going to be our primary topic, I think, going forward with a few fascinating talks. I have put into chat our current schedule, and right now we are on break. Of course, those who wish can stay around and chit chat. We are going to be started on Isaac Askin's talk and paper entitled The Will around 4:10, so just over 5 minutes. Please grab refreshments, do as you will, and we'll see you back here in a couple minutes. Thank you very much. Hey, Dr. Potter, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well.
Because you have this beautiful background, I'm never sure if that's your image actually, right? Have you created a still, your picture, when you're not there? Should just be that.
Yeah, right.
Still, right?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? I've had some mic issues. Okay. Yeah.
It sounds good. Scott, it's been forever.
I wondered if you could have a GIF, just put
It's
yourself
moving
on
too.
repeat. There you go.
It's a great mic. I mean, you look like a real YouTuber.
Oh, yeah.
I agree.
Hey, Scott.
How you doing? Yeah, I'm just at school, but all the kids are gone.
It's
for the math.
Yeah, but look, you've got students in person. What a wonderful.
Oh, it's great. Yeah. Looking forward to E6's paper. He was in my class and we've been emailing back and forth recently. So I'm looking forward to hearing that.
Isaac, if you're there,
Yeah.
I want to make sure that I'm pronouncing your name properly. Forgive me.
So it's actually pretty funny because no one pronounces my name correctly, even in my own class. So I've been trying to keep that hidden, but it's Ishik.
Ishik.
Yeah, like an SH. Yeah, yeah, it's all right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Many
You
things.
can unpin me, Stephanie.
Yes, ma'am. To remove your spotlight. I have to admit the ongoing issue in my household is the misinformation campaign. And, you know, and you and I even were talking last time about this idea of, you know, some people want to say, look at the postmodernist project, the post-structuralist project, and look at what it has wrought. Now, I happen to think those kinds of arguments are bunk, but yeah, I wonder how the background for anti-colonialist arguments is changing. You know, maybe not so much specifically in biomedical ethics, but in a way, the last thing I want to do is change the definition of death, because I don't want to inspire people to begin to think about all of the interesting kinds of definitions of death that one could possibly believe. And what will a Facebook post look like? What, you know, how does this raise an issue around, for example, misinformation could congregate? That may feel like an extreme thing to say. Maybe I don't even specifically worry about that, but I do wonder how our discussions about some of these issues will change. Of course, with the great threat to Western liberalism and a distrust of science that we see in practice now. It's a larger issue, it's challenging, but I wondered if you've reflected on that with respect to some of the anti-colonialism work that you've done. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, was somebody saying something? You know, it's in some ways decoloniality and decolonization is not even something that's done by the dominant culture. It's something that in a lot of ways sidesteps the dominant culture to build something of its own. And so like one of the things that the Zapatistas is a really good example of that and is used a lot in talking about decoloniality. But you know, groups of people that try to sidestep capitalism and have their own economies, or a lot of indigenous people now and scholars and activists are doing things like that to bring back their traditional values and their traditional education and their languages, and all of those things are decoloniality. So in some ways, trying to decolonize a colonial institution is it's like, how do you de-Christianize Christianity? You know, how do you decolonize capitalism? Capitalism is the foundation of colonialism. So, you know, it's almost, what I'm doing is almost probably not quite decolonial enough, but it's trying to bring some of these concepts to all of us so that we can think through them rather than sidestepping everybody. So.
I was talking to one of the nurses over at the Native Medical Center, and he said that it's not unusual for for Native people that are in the hospital there to be on life support for over a year. Because if they want to have the patient on life support, the family can say, yeah, we're going to do it. And it's all paid for on top of it. So he feels really bad because, you know, they're not alive in the sense that, you know, we would think of alive, and he's shoving tubes in their butt, you know, and all the other holes. And it's disgusting. And, you know, the relatives just continue to have hope, but they never recover. And then, you know, finally, 2 years later, they decide, well, I guess it's time to take them off life support because they've just been dead, to use that colonial definition of dead. So, I mean, you know, that's an example of where I guess based on race, we're allowing the native definition of death, even if that is the native definition of death. I'm not sure that it is.
Yeah, Scott, thank you.
Oh yeah.
That fascinating issue, important one. Jenny, you don't even have a chance to respond. This is still the 16th annual UAA Undergraduate Philosophy Conference, and we're continuing with papers this afternoon. We'll begin here with Ishik Askin, reading and talking about his paper, The Will. What kind of signal would you like with respect to time?
Just a thumbs up, I guess, is fine. I'll set up a stopwatch for myself too and stuff.
Okay,
but just a thumbs up is fine.
All right, sounds good. And would you like me to change the view so that you're in the main speaker view like Jenny?
Sure, doesn't really matter with me.
It's pretty fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have a presentation today. I'm just going to read the paper and get through it. All right. All right, good to go?
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right. Just to sort of basically just go through the paper. I add some visuals, but I want to keep it as concise as possible. So, the traditional Cartesian structure that once dominated the center of metaphysics has seemingly been abandoned in due part to frustration and practicalness. The materialist position has been given use and attention in response to the difficulties of the interaction problem of dualism, as well as the advances of logical positivist science. In doing so, this certain abandonment leaves open wide areas of critique, of which of utmost importance lies at the stance of the self. Functionalist answers to what the subject of the mind may be leave a lack of fulfillment in response to external reality, as well as the self, as arguments of qualia highlight. In this essay, I will introduce a reworked Schopenhauerian will that is unconscious, object-oriented, and internal, and aims to be synonymous with the best account for a self, and in doing so will also help the validity of the external world. Similar to various aspects of panpsychism, it will have the advantage against dualism and natural materialist arguments, as it will broaden the scopes of intrinsic properties, accept qualia, and yet still admit the firmness of physicality. The primary problem at the heart of reality has always seemingly been the threat of solipsism. This is a claim that all that exists is a self, and that all external reality is questionable and perhaps unreal. While some claims of the idea have been the underpinnings of philosophical arguments, the actual belief in the stance has never truly been completely held in substantial matter. The problem is, though, its connection to other arguments, like the validities of qualia or nature of selves, have all pathways to lead to this assumption, which in itself always seems to be looming around. In doing so, we become in need of proper definitions of selves that may fit accordingly to the objective world. For this sense, the self that we must deal with is a backdrop self, and that can be most identifiable with what we may be. Descartes' distinguishment between the mind and the body underlies the primary problem at hand, the identification of the self. For Descartes, it cannot be had within a conscious awareness of its properties, but the self that we are concerned with is different. According to his dualism in the Cogito, what can be inferred is a pairing of a backdrop self and the mind as one. The premise Leibniz articulates in his law, and the basic argument Descartes goes for is the statement, I cannot doubt the mind. Here we already have a problem as we are distinguishing the I and the mind. In terms of the identity of indiscernibles, which states that if two entities share all their properties, then both are the same object, we have a possible unshared area. The I is already presupposed and is in a state of subjectiveness within the sentence. The mind, on the other hand, is an object of this, supposedly self-referring within the actual statement. Following the principle, the mind may differ in one primary way from the I, its logical insufficient nature to be equated with the self. Exploring the distinction, the primary phrase in question must actually be the validity of the self's properties. While both are in the same position of being viewed internally, the problem is, though, that the self is definitionally not equatable to a property of awareness. A rock or any inanimate object may be referred to derivatively as it having a self, as a statement only dictates a definition of identity. Furthermore, within every experience, the self is always presupposed and not referred to. It is a level of subjectivity that dissipates when it is objectified, and as its entire nature is to be that initial subjective being. The self in this context is non-reflexive, and is what is meant as a backdrop self. In this case, a self is always existing in being, regardless if that self can be a source for a mind or not. For other purposes, one may be able to think of the psychological subconscious as another example of a differentiation of a Cartesian mind and a self. One cannot think of the subconsciousness, but the subconscious presupposes self in the first place as well. Both are presupposing a root. The distinction can be viewed primarily lexically, but the aim is to separate what a subject may be in response to its attachment with a mind. For the time being, the self does have a characteristic that must be kept if we are to explore the possibilities, a level of distinction between it and the otherness of the world. If we are to keep dualism, we are also forced to admit solipsism and due fact the unknowability of that other world. If we were to equate the mind with itself and admit the mind as an axiomatic truth, then any attempts at proving the external world will be met with a level of insufficientness. In Cartesian terms, there is no perfect knowledge to be had here, but one in terms of probability that is really only accepted by theological arguments. For the case here, if we do not consider God, there is nothing stopping one to completely disbelieve the validity of an external world, as it cannot be had within the indisputableness of the self. That is why here the separation between the self and the mind is incredibly important. If done so, then intrinsically speaking, there are already two forces at play before physicality, a subject and subject's mind. And this knowledge to the mind directly becomes presupposed of the self and is not as perfect as this knowledge as acquisition seems to be. In regards to all of this, dualism leaves open a path to solipsism, which although can logically be sound within its argumentative structures, cannot be done so if we distinguish consciousness from the self. With this, the first primary question can be asked: is there something more fundamental than consciousness that can be equated with the self? Now the dualistic problem is explored, it might be important to address the materialist concerns. For this position, that before the self can be argued, one needs to keep important concerns in check, that are primarily consciousness and qualia. The former can be safely given to weak emergent arguments for the time being, as compatibility to physicalism may lend help for the future. The problem then arises at qualia, for both emergent and reductionist accounts. If consciousness is a requirement of various neurophysiological conditions to exist, this does not completely evade the question of feeling certain phenomena. There is a lacking element that under business, a phenomenal sort of information that is associated with a non-physical, even if causally connected and possibly necessitated. Thus, reductionist arguments to explain consciousness become problematic as they leave out subjective experience. Keeping the emergent structure in place with the question of qualia mind, we become in need of intrinsic fundamental entities to emergent consciousness. Here, we may be tempted to build a strong emergent foundation instead, as it would seem the higher level orders that is consciousness become free from complete irreducibility to a lower level of physical parts. Still, it would be false and paradoxical to say that consciousness itself is that fundamental higher level phenomenon as well as a baseline unit for it to arise. As you begin to find problems of overdetermination, both lower level bases and higher level bases would begin to be sufficiently explained by themselves and each other. For the case of consciousness, having it as a higher order entity in need of physiological structures would result in this dilemma, as you would also be supposing consciousness as a sufficient lower level order. So, although fundamental essences are required, they cannot be physically reducible, but a higher order entity must still be. To keep visuals in check, the simple structure can be viewed as C equals P and I. The proposition is that consciousness is dependent on both physical and intrinsic forces for it to emerge, but one that is not explanatory solely within those same forces. In this sense, the structure is weak emergent and somewhat proto-panpsychist, where the final outcome is not its own fundamental entity, but one that needs an intrinsic part to help it arise. The former physical entities can be understood as simple neurophysiological structures, but the latter needs its own explanation as how qualia emerge is its own problem. Another way to view the situation is accepting the correlation that lies between conscious states and physical changes, but also needing that extra qualitative factor. With this, another question can be grasped and held on to is this: is there a non-physical substance that can explain a necessary, but not sufficient explanation for consciousness and qualia? Furthermore, in regards to materialism's reductive attitudes towards consciousness in relation to this emergent structure, one may see further roots of logical incompleteness and a leap of faith. As explained, the problem with reductionist accounts is that they leave out subjective experience. In doing so, though, the most presupposed thing, the self, becomes illusionary in response to more functionalist views. If we were to admit that the self, or any sense of internality, had to be existence for knowledge to occur, then one cannot be able to logically throw away the self or the mind. Furthermore, in this case, in a Cartesian sort of way, there is only a sort of adherence to the physical world in connection with this mind reductionism. There is no method to prove it, rather it is taken for granted, and furthermore, used to disprove the end is provable. Problems of external reality being illusionary or hallucinatory are disregarded, even though it would be conceivably possible to alter the mind in functional terms to change the representation of objective reality. This is the leap of faith, as although it does not lead to solipsism in a dualist case, it leads to the denial of the most fundamental self and not irrealism. This is why we must keep the intrinsic entity in formulating the emergent structure. We now have a fundamental problem with both dualism and materialism, a need for another thing within metaphysical structures. Dualism fails us definitionally with the concept of a mind, and furthermore begs validity of external reality, as it gives unconditional belief to consciousness and doubt to the body. Materialism, on the other hand, takes a leap of faith in assuming this reality itself, and completely skips the qualitative aspect of consciousness. Not only is there not sufficient form of self in either theory, but both leave room for either solipsism or self-denial. The two questions can primarily...
I'm so sorry.
Oh, sure.
Slow down just a little.
Yeah, I'm going fast.
Fantastic. So far, thank you.
The two questions can primarily be combined to ask, what is the fundamental thing that can be associated with the self and explain consciousness and qualia? Following the criticisms of dualism and materialism, we have a few constraints that may help us in finding what this may be. The first is that it must be a thing presupposed, as we've already seen that a dualistic mind is not the only thing that can be intrinsic. The second is that it must be unconscious, as it must separate itself from any sort of awareness to be able to be synonymous with the self. Thirdly, it must be compatible with the emergent structure of consciousness, as explained before, as this will prove helpful in further separating it from consciousness in a way that will still keep physioneurological accounts intact. In order to present a good theory of the self, it must account for subjectivity without falling into accepting a physical monism, and these constraints help do so. The question held in by these constraints can be answered sufficiently by a reworked idea of will. Will in this sense can draw its origin to Schopenhauer, but later will be with a few modifications. He regarded the will as discoverable through introspection, an unconscious desire that underlies all phenomena, a thing in itself that can be felt within and can be attributed to the intrinsic core that is the noumena. The world acts as a sort of representation of the will, as the categories of the understanding mitigate and modify the will for the creation of phenomena, and explain the fact that objects do not just dissipate instantaneously. This is the starting point that we may interpret a more analytic version, and a version that can sufficiently answer the fundamental question. The will, for this purpose, can be redefined as physically the unconscious and object-oriented action associated with movements through time and space, and intrinsically that which underlies all of physical reality as the primary self. Perhaps the best word that can be explanatory for the idea is the concept of being. This definition of the will may be better constructed if one were to simplify it down to an act through time and space physically, and through time and conceptual space intrinsically. By doing so, we need a definition of action, which itself is required of the aforementioned elements. Schopenhauer puts a special emphasis on the law of causality through these two categories, and thus any causal existence to the two becomes a reality of action. Time without space leaves nothing for actuality, as nothing is there to be mediated on. Space without time is not only not permanent, but impossible, as even immovable perpetuation is indicative of time. In doing so, we need a unified continuity between the two, and any and all phenomena that exist in space, and it's mediated by time. As Schopenhauer states, its being is action, as any sort of being must act in this sense. What is seemingly in question here is abstract ideas like will can do the same. Will in the Schopenhauerian sense is an undivided unity that is not rooted in spatio-temporal laws, and thus is beyond any sort of Kantian constraints. For this reworked will, there's a similar idea that physical spatio-temporal laws cannot affect the will, as any indication of it being so would revert back to it being a physical force. But there must be a similar line of thought in the intrinsic level, at least conceptually. That is why we must refer to space as conceptual space, a fabric of nothingness that ideas and possibilities may relate upon. Will, when present in physical form, is always unconsciously synchronous with acts and physicality, but intrinsically is mediated by time in its conceptual space. In other words, it is perpetually existing. In the internal sense, the action can just be conceptual, but physically it is always manifest in these acts, these spatio-temporal acts. The will is always acting. One of the greatest abilities to perceive how will works in regards to the action itself is the ficting idea of positing the I. In this idea, the formation of the I is determined by a conscious formation of the concept unitarily by itself. The whole idea is that during the act of self-consciousness, the objectification of the I leaves an empty space to be filled by itself, quite paradoxically. There becomes a unity with the fact of the I and the act of the posit. Furthermore, Fichte states that in acting, the rational being does not become conscious of its acting, for it itself is acting and nothing else. The objectification of the I, which itself, according to this, can never be consciously aware of its acting, primarily creates the setting for redirecting Fichte's propositions and going forwards for the will. The necessity of needing an I for an action to posit the I is a contradiction according to Fichte, but there is still a general sense of consciousness during the action. This is where the fine line between consciousness and the will come into play. As stated before, the will is in synchronic unity with the actions of the conscious sort, as it acts as a sort of being that manifests itself in consciousness. In this sense, it is the level of consciousness that Fichte needs before the posit of the I. In regards to the traditional formation of actions requiring beings beforehand, which itself may act as a sort of criticism to fluid motions of the self, one can easily view the beings that act as being through time and space themselves. Subjects in this matter are constantly in motion in any sense with respect to the idea. Thus, in the I posits the I, the word posits becomes most synonymous with the idea of the will, as the first I can only exist with the meaning of the rest of the sentence, and the second I is that which manifests the first. The only thing that is fundamentally being and object-oriented is the word posits, that which is most fundamentally connected with the self. Due to the will's extension as a sort of universal underlying intrinsic factor, one may begin to draw resemblances to contemporary idealists or neutral monist ideas, which may start a pathway to the will in relation to C equals P and I. And if I were to take the Russellian view, we may be met with the idea that reality is fundamentally made up of external physical properties and intrinsic properties. On the internal side, we may find the need for quiddities that are not associated with the mind or body to be explanatory helpful for the creation of consciousness. The claim that these quiddities are phenomenal, as the panpsychist may hold, is a problem that is not only hurt by the previously mentioned problem of overdetermination, but also urgently mitigated by weak induction. Degrees of consciousness stemming from introspection as being candidates for intrinsic properties is primarily fallacious due to the fact that one assumes that our internal experience is primarily of consciousness, and that any other entity must also have this to a certain degree if all we may feel is consciousness. The problem is that nothing in external reality is indicative of this. There may be different sources of intrinsic properties that may not resemble consciousness at all, and any attempts at doing so is strongly hurt by induction. Nothing in physical reality tells of intrinsic consciousness, but it only tells of will, as the persisting of things through time and space are indicative of it. In this way, neutral monism and a theory of the will share the fact that there is a third option between the mind and the body. Still, even if the will's object orientation is helpful for persistence, and the will might still possibly be similar to the phenomenal aspects of panpsychism, and its level of uniqueness might be dissipated due to this objection. It is categorized as intrinsic and object-oriented, and its common accompaniment with consciousness might be a way for an Occam's razor to be used against it, as it seems very similar to the idea. In response, the will can still be understood as a quiddity, but one that should not be necessarily phenomenal. It is, on the other hand, interactive and proto-phenomenal, in the sense that it is a constant unconscious objectification of its surroundings. It still acts as an intrinsic entity, but that which is prior to any sense of phenomenal properties. In a way, the will becomes identifiable as a possible candidate as to what a proto-phenomenal property may be like. Consciousness, if it were to exist in, say, a rock, would, according to panpsychists, be in micro-level terms. But this fails the definitions of what consciousness is to be. Rock lacks the neurophysiological structure of what may constitute our sense or any sense of consciousness. But if it were to have microphenomenal properties, this would again be hurt by induction and overdetermination. This level of microness becomes so low level that it should not be perceived as being a degree of consciousness at all, but rather a state of interaction. The way the rock may be within the world lacks a level of self-consciousness and does nothing but be. The nature of the object is in constant interaction, and the most fundamental level of object orientation is that of the interaction between the essence of the rock and, let's say, the ground. The physical interaction is derived, but the essential touch is precisely what the will is, an unconscious act of a self. The obvious question afterwards seems to be the nature of this will self. It begins to not only be something that is in constant motion, but that which is unconscious of itself and in totality. At the same time, it seems to be synonymous with consciousness at distinct points in time, as it is in constant subject-object relational continuity. In unison, one may start to view it in terms of being a self before self-consciousness, a sort of self directly conscious of surrounding objects, but also a self-unconscious being. In this sense, it begins to draw similarities to a Hegelian idea of sense certainty, or any other dialectical level before self-consciousness. Thus, the question becomes this in simplicity: is the will the state of being at a specific point in time? When it comes to the will being a state of consciousness at specific points in time, it may perhaps manifest in such a way, but is not only present in these examples. For the cases that do have it, it may be reasonable to say it is accompanied during consciousness. And any awareness of those conscious acts accompanied by the will becomes acts of memory and fail in synchronicity through time. For the cases that do not need consciousness, one need not look further than the body and the objective world. Schopenhauer viewed the will as greatly present and almost witnessable with the acts of the body. The movement of a hand does not have an internal conscious action, but it has an internal action nonetheless, and can be seen as an objectification of the will. The neurophysiological structure of consciousness is not in place in the arm. The weak emergent form is not there, but the intrinsic properties of being and acting are. Another way to visualize this is to use Friedrich Albert Lange's explanation of physiological organization and representation. Here, the body, due to its existence and physicality, is also subject to epistemological idealism, as one only seeks a representation of the object. Due to this, there can exist a sort of thing in itself within ourselves. Since there is a level of extended subjectivity within the body, though, one can begin to see how an unconscious will may be present here. The movement of an arm, thus, is an example of an act of the will that is not equipped with consciousness. Furthermore, the results of the will's being can be seen everywhere in physical reality. As stated before, the will is what explains the continuity of the objects, as a constant being is that of itself, a thing that perpetuates infinitely. That is why the will works as a better candidate than consciousness as a fundamental essence. Consciousness is primarily internal in experience and can never be witnessed in physical reality, but the will has the advantage of both. The will is intrinsic by nature, but can be witnessed through its representation and results in physical reality. The constant being of the objects necessitates a thing of unity, and the only thing must be being itself. Now that we have laid the groundwork of various definitions and properties the will may have, it will be helpful to return to materialism and dualism and how a theory of the will can forego the problems associated with the previous two theories. In this process, it might be helpful to return to the idea of the weak emergent structure that might be able to incorporate the will as well. With regards to the dualist mind, the will differs on a conceptual basis. While a dualist mind as a sort of entity that the self is an identity, its problems with the principle of the identity of the discernibles in respect to the self poses it as a problem for its validity. When the statement, "I cannot doubt the mind," is brought forward, it is not the mind, the dualistic sense, that is being most fundamentally utilized. It is, as its mere existence is based on its action of thought. It is the will. Analogous to the Fichtean sentence, the action of the thought is where the will may lie in. The will is that which is in synchronic unity with the act of the being, which itself, as mind, can only be conscious of afterwards, or conscious in its contents as they are conceptualized within the paradigms of its temporal objects. In other words, while the mind may think of the sentence, the self is presupposed, but that actual awareness of that fact is not directly aware of in that specific point in time. Due to this, when doubting or thinking, the dualistic mind is, while in practice, not alone in its internal existence. What is also internal is the will. In this case, its property of presupposition is shared with the self. For the time being, the theory of will differs from dualism in the way that it goes past the question of if a self can be synonymous with the mind. For it is not a mind, it is a self. In regards to materialism, it is compatible with the physical structures that may underlie consciousness, but it does not go against intrinsic properties. Structural arguments for consciousness do not sufficiently explain the totality of the phenomenon, but rather its structural correlations. With this in mind, the problem of qualia do not create a solid materialist sense of self, as even if one can create a sort of nominalist view, the problem of experience always poses a problem. If one begins to acknowledge that consciousness is nothing but a functionalist system of the brain, and that this can be a possible candidate for a self, and that qualitative factor will always be left out, but unfortunately would naturally be yearned for any sense of a self and a subject. In this case, an intrinsic property is needed for the formation of the self. Following this emergent structure previously articulated, the will must be able to, jointly with physical processes, emerge into consciousness. The objection now seems to be that if the will is an unconscious force, how is it sufficiently able to explain qualia, a conscious force? Qualia is dictated on strictly subjective and experiential terms. If we admit that consciousness, in anthropomorphic terms, requires its physical structures and a proto-phenomenal quiddity to weakly emerge into human awareness, then we must see how this proto-phenomenal quiddity relates to qualia. Qualia is distinct in its characteristic from functionalist answers primarily on the level of the feeling of the subject. It would not be hard to imagine how a fundamentally baseline subject as the will can create qualia. Will as the unconscious subject can be seen as problematic, but once neurophysiological structures start to help form memory through neurons in the hippocampus and whatever else is needed in the physical process, one can start seeing how physical attributes can help emerge experience from a non-experiential, but still subjective force. Qualia, directly speaking, can be sufficiently explained for if we have that synchronic self that accompanies consciousness. Eyesight, touching, sense input all can require that feel of a self, the will, alongside their physical conscious structures. This does not explain how objects may have qualia within, as one may see in neutral modism, but can explain why qualia can emerge within and for us. In regards to the weak emergent structure then, if the will can be explanatory for experience due to its synonymity with its property of subjectiveness, then it can fulfill the need for an intrinsic but unconscious essence if we have our mental categories, memories, and any other brain force. The joint problem for both dualism and materialism is its relation to solipsism. The former accepts a theory if the line of reasoning is followed, and the latter forgoes it completely and instead merely assumes the objective world. The theory of will, on the other hand, can bypass both problems. If the will were to only exist as an idea within conceptual space, it would never have the ability to be in its effects without its representational side, and all that we would experience would dissipate. For the will to be in physical reality, it underlies and accompanies the acts through time and space, the ones that apply to the physical world. As our mind incorporates and perceives through the categorical concepts that mediate the input of objects, we begin to require the external stimuli for us to cognize the perceptions. Objects are not fully satisfied a priori, and they require an actual level of there-ness for it to cause any sense of representation. The will acts as a backdrop of this process and can present itself in physical reality only through this Kantian structure. As entire nature is that of the act and its object orientation, it becomes clear that it needs an object. Where the distinction of objects is a trick of the mind, that may possibly be the case, but the need of a thing for the subjectiveness of the will to relate to is highly important. If one were to abandon the physical components of human consciousness, one would still not be able to live in a soul-mind reality, or perhaps a soul-willed one. The prime intrinsic essence is the will, but it can never be conscious of itself without that extra added layer of consciousness to act as a sort of self-realization and transformation into that which realizes it. In this case, in a solipsistic world, there are already two entities in play, that of the will and that of consciousness. For consciousness even to form ideas about the will would require various levels of time and subconsciousness to already have it as a complex system for it to further separate it from the will. The categories of the mind are being applied, and a pure intrinsic world becomes impossible. Schopenhauer states that all will is a single will, following the principium individuationis, or the principle of individuation, as alienation from multiplicity due to time and space being applicable only to the physical world. In other beings, the cognition of will is mediated by laws and categories of perception, and thus becomes a representation. All of this may be the case, but any sort of representation of the will in the physical world can act as the objective world, even if it were to be another fold of itself for itself to relate to. Due to this, solipsism can simply not exist, and if it can, the will of totality becomes different than the will of the self, as the latter becomes another fold of the prior. It can be interpreted as an idealist monism, but not solipsistic. Whether the will is singular or divided is irrelevant, as in either case, the objective world becomes existence as a necessity, as the will is in constant interaction. Here the self is needed, but the external world is not abandoned. In conclusion, the will is a fundamental thing that exists intrinsically and that is explanatory in arguments about qualia. It is not consciousness in exact form, but it is a consciousness that exists within specific points in time. Due to the physical elements of consciousness, the will becomes the prime candidate for an identification of the self, as it is never reducible to physical structures, but is always presupposed in them, as well as qualia. It helps to disprove solipsism through its essential nature and can be compatible with neurophysiological structures in order to help in a weak emergent structure of consciousness. Thumbs up.
Hey, bravo. Thank you very much. We have some time for questions.
Yep.
Would anyone like to start us off?
I have one if you're interested.
Sure. Let me change the view as well. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I changed it.
Okay.
So the question I have, in The Triumph of the Will, Hitler associates his will with the Volk, the will of the people. In what sense do you think the will is a social consciousness?
So that's basically where I try to split the will and not make it social. So the will, from Schopenhauer, like the biggest thing with Schopenhauer and the will is really this ethical social side and how it creates problems and whatnot. And then you have obviously Nietzsche taking it in a different area. I think the will in this sense is completely different. I think it can manifest in social ways if we interpret it that way. But I think that's possible to interpret it that way, that it can, the constant driving force or constant objectification and, this sort of clash of selves can be a certain way. So I think it definitely has a place in social spheres, very much so. That's usually where the will is talked about, is in ethical and social spheres. Let's see.
Yeah, I could ask more questions if no one else is.
Oh yeah, I mean you can. I think I saw Keldon. I just opened the participants thing.
I don't have everybody in view here.
Yeah, I just got to
change my.
Hey, Ishik, sorry, I've been saying your name wrong all semester.
It's all good. It's all good. I've been going through that my entire life.
So I'll soon be rambling about basically the cosmological value of the Jewish Ein Sof, the Chinese Tao, and the Egyptian Ennead to panpsychism. Mm-hmm. And I guess I hear a lot of what you're saying about the will and what I'm researching. And I think my question is, I'm wondering if you think we can interfere with the will, because some sections I had to cut out, particularly looking at difference in the Hermetic versus the Gnostic view of the universe. It seems like Gnostics kind of look at the will as this other that is actually like a savior. And the Hermetics, often through symbols, think that we can kind of greaten the will. So I'm wondering if you think we can interfere with it and why.
I think it really depends on how we're trying to define a will with that. I mostly view the will as something that's, I think the word interfering with the will is hard to really do, because I think we're always interfering with it. But any sort of awareness of that fact is, you're not really aware of the thing. So for example, a big similarity with what I'm talking about is, I don't know if you're familiar with Ibn Arabi, and it's medieval Islamic thought, but I think it was called the Al-Thought or something, where the whole idea is something irreferable. That's something that is present at the same time, but that which is irreferable. That's usually where I think of the will is something that is it's really hard to explain, but basically as I'm talking, I am manifesting the will, right? If we're viewing the will in more these spiritual terms, I mean, I'm sure there's some, various different thoughts about that. But the way I view it, I think it's mostly just irreferable,
Well, I remember you saying something like it doesn't matter if it's one or two. And
yeah.
My whole theory is kind of based on monism, or at least the idea of it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I guess I view interfering with it or stopping it or greatening it. Like, I wonder if it's some force happening to us or if we're acting in tandem with it,
Yeah, I mean, I usually am in the ballpark of it being a single thing. Like, I mentioned the principle of individuation. Like, the whole idea of multiplicity is something that's physical, or at least in that Kantian sense. And so the will itself must be singular. So yeah, I guess, if you view it in a single overarching, like this almost like spirit, I think there's some interesting lines you can go through that. Yeah.
I'm thinking you like music. I don't know how I got that impression.
Oh, yeah.
If so, maybe you're familiar with the Wagnerian ring cycle.
Yeah.
And Wotan is so frustrated because he keeps trying to achieve, what he wants, what he desires, and the will fights him at every step. So in that sense, it seems like, this is a Schopenhauer sense of the will, that it's external really to Wotan, but it's using him and forces him along a path that he's actually trying to resist, which makes it a fascinating. I don't know if you like The Ring or not, but yeah.
I mean, it's a 9-hour thing, so I've never listened in totality. But yeah, no, Wagner was like I think a friend of Schopenhauer's, I think, or like he really liked Schopenhauer, and yeah, the idea of the will is very much in there. Yeah, but it's usually seen as a sort of like striving oppositional force. But not only on, like you said, not only on the external side, but also on the internal. And the whole problem is it's always going to butt heads with itself. At least that's usually the line of reasoning, yeah.
I've been infected by that whole thing. I've been watching it since I was in high school, and I haven't watched it or listened to it as many times as Hitler did, but
yeah.
And I'm not a Nazi, so just listening to Wagner doesn't make you a racist or a Nazi or an anti-Semite.
Yeah,
I'm puzzled about that, but
yeah, Wagner was a character, that's for sure. Dr. Potter, I think you were first. I think you're muted.
Okay, there I am.
Yeah,
my question is more of a kind of a clarificatory question.
Yeah.
Near the end, you characterized your position as non-solipsistic idealist monism, and you were critiquing Cartesian dualism because maybe Descartes can establish the existence of the mind, but the existence of the external world depends on God's existence, and so that argument is suspect. I think it'd be helpful to me if you could say a little bit or kind of recap your position on how this gets us out of solipsism. If it's idealist and monistic, that sounds like kind of a lot like solipsism.
Yeah. So in a sense, it could be solipsistic, but so usually with solipsism, like we're usually viewing our whole mind as like that perfect, like you can't really escape it. That's all you can really know is the mind, right? So with accounting for the will, you're basically escaping the mind. You're basically saying that there is something else still within you, but not that you can really think of, right? That's sort of self before self unconsciousness. So in doing so, in accepting that, you're already not soul mind. You're already basically escaping the mind. You're still not accepting the physical world. That's the next step, but you're still, agreeing that there's a self before your mind. It could still be solipsistic if you agree. It can't really be solipsistic if you accept that there's a single will and that everybody is this sort of like single self. it's sort of solipsism, but not really, because then you're just seeing the objective world as just like it's still there. You could say it's the same will as a single entity, as a single monism, but it's not solipsism because you can admit that there's other minds, and that these other minds can also be further manifestations of will. But it's not like soul mind, basically. It's a soul entity, but not soul mind.
I think it would help me if you could say how I can be confident about other minds, even if they originate in some one will. More confident about that than on the dualist account.
Yeah. So with other minds, I guess it's a little bit harder. That is also in its own way a leap of faith, but at least with this, you're understanding that there is objects for the will to relate to. And if you can say that minds of other people facilitate different movements through in objective reality, and if those things kind of are there for the will to relate to, then you can mostly accept the minds. The minds of other people are still maybe a weak spot, because the minds are not will, but the minds are also not like complete physicality. So there is still, I guess, some assumption with other minds.
I think it's interesting that Dr. Potter is asking someone else to help him with the issue of other minds.
That's another big problem.
I mean, that's another mind that he's asking, you know, so. But,
yeah.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah. I think Professor Scott Johnson. I think your hand's raised. Yeah.
Yeah, you have a couple.
Trying to take down my hand.
Yeah.
So Joel asked the same question that I asked, that I was going to ask. You know, you talked about the self as consciousness leads us towards solipsism. Did I get that right?
The self as consciousness. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, and then the self as a preconscious will saves us from solipsism. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned Schopenhauer's principle of individuation, which emerges when the will becomes conscious. It's an illusion of consciousness. Does that seem?
The illusion, I'm a little skeptical about using the word illusion, but you could definitely argue that the consciousness is just another representation of will. It's like it's you can almost view consciousness as a sort of like bridge between intrinsic and physical, I guess. But yeah, through the principle of individuation, yeah.
So before you answer Joel's question, I was going to ask, without the principle of individuation, aren't we led back into solipsism? Yeah. But then you said minds are not wills, or should I more accurately say minds are not will, singular. Yeah. And I guess I was just fascinated by your paper because I remember the discussions that you and I had in the class about solipsism and how that was one of your main interests.
Yeah, I used to be a solipsist in your class. Yeah. Well, maybe. The thing is, the main point with how I'm trying to go with solipsism is not even really about the will. It's mostly actually just through Kantian stuff. But with the will, like, again, you can still kind of have a solipsism. I'm not comfortable with using the word solipsism in this case, but if you're admitting it that it's just one single self, and then that's who for example, that's who I am just a self in the deepest core, that in a certain way is solipsism. But when I consider solipsism, I'm mostly considering my thoughts and this sort of brain stuff. Yeah. Or it doesn't have to be brain stuff. It's just my thoughts, the actual consciousness that I am. But because we have this sort of really internal deep self, it's not really solipsism in the sense. And if furthermore, connecting with Kantian stuff, just the mere fact that we have stimuli to even relate to and do stuff with is solipsism's not really there.
Yeah. If solipsism is, what if I'm the only one that has a mind and everybody else is just a robot?
Yeah.
That's solved if we're all just one giant will.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why it's like, it could be a soul will reality, but that's, then that's like, then what's all this stuff? And that's his own problem. Manifestation, I guess.
You really thought it out. You really thought it out. I was kind of laying out the argument while you were talking. This is awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Did you have another question? Oh, your hands.
Oh no, I just didn't pick down my hand. It's
okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
Bravo, 3 cheers. Feel free to unmute yourselves for a raucous applause.
Woo!
I'm excited for Keldon's presentation because mine's basically semi-proto-panpsychist and then yours is panpsychist. So I'm pretty excited for Keldon's presentation to see how it relates.
That's awesome.
Yeah, great segue, seriously.
Yeah, very good. And nice advertisement.
Yeah.
We look forward to Keldon's paper in a couple minutes. Please feel free to stand up, do some mini aerobics, get the blood flowing. Yes, snacks.
I brought the pizza.
I know this is such a curious kind of conference. And I think some of us have done other kinds of national conferences as well online, right? Like this. And, you know, it's a different kind of experience. My husband is in IT and he goes to various password conferences. And I'll just say, he and his colleagues are already plugged in. And I think it's a different experience for them. There's multiple simultaneous chat rooms. It's, shall I say, it's more organic.
Well, this all does fit in with the question of solipsism, because how much of this is social, how much of it is just my own experience, internal experience.
I'd like to thank the leadership for organizing this for us lowly overachieving undergrads. And it's pretty cool that Ronald Sundstrom commenced our conference. I really liked what he had to say about agential racism and systemic differences. That was interesting. So this research paper is originally a 10-part, and I shortened it a little bit for time. I still get to about 7 of them. Feel free to email me if you'd like to see what I have omitted. It's mostly intentionality, and which is pretty much covered. And then the Gnostic and Hermetic implications of a panpsychic world, which I asked of Isaac. So I have a bit of a weak voice. I have a cough drop, and I hope you can hear me okay. I think I'll make it through. I've not been talking for a couple days, so I'll do my best. So I'm going to preface my reading with the abstract and then some terms. The precise ordering of the nature of mind and reality has been contended by all with a mind to ponder for as long as humans have reflected on existence. In a scenario where the sum of premises do not reach the established conclusion, the remaining considerations must be accurate. This is true regardless of how absurd they appear to be. Scientific physicalism has continued to fail to account for consciousness, despite a technology boom unparalleled in known history. In this paper, I will argue for the existence of attributive panpsychism, the logistical projection of multidimensional matter encompassing both biological structuralism and the being of creation. This will be conveyed through the lens of attributive panpsychic traits as evidenced by computing, philosophy of cosmology, and the analysis of mathematical logic, which rules any tongue, is devoid of a need to frame hypotheses. I will continue to outline why panpsychism is more plausible than other fringe views, particularly strong emergence, in a lens of intentional time and human becoming. Some terms. Attributive panpsychism is the logistical projection of multidimensional matter encompassing both biological structuralism and the being of creation. Conceivability is a tool of conception used in philosophy. Something is possible if something is conceivable. Maximality is the scientific principle by which nature reaches its totality by itself, utilizing efficiency through nature. Panpsychism is an ancient theory which holds all matter has consciousness, or particularly experience. Physicalism is the dominant materialist philosophy of most scientists. And the saturation principle you won't find anywhere. Rebecca Goldstein coined this in a presentation I really like, talking about Spinoza's metaphysics and how it differs from Leibniz's. And it's basically the idea that founded Einstein's thinking of reasons upon reasons. So it's an, as she says, uber rationalist thinking, which ironically turned out to be right and established modern physics. And supervenience is a method of structural overlap within physicalist layers. Panpsychism. Panpsychism, the theory that experiential mind is the core essence existing throughout the cosmos, is the most plausible theory of mind. Panpsychism incorporates necessary elements of the universe we describe today. Intentionality is core to panpsychism, a problem unanswered by materialists. A form of telos, functional purpose, is accounted for with the panpsychic expansion of the universe as part of the cone-shaped spacetime. This helps to account for why there is something rather than nothing. Suppressing materialist fallacies, the self-directionality to panpsychism is also evident to, sufficient in, and necessary for our becoming as conscious entities. The matter of physics falls short in this twofold realization experienced by looking into the abyss. This would not be possible if matter had no properties of mind. The Markov blanket of neutral monism implies the sentient physics inherent to the view of panpsychism. This is applicable to the transfer of information as perceived stimuli in a panpsychic world as presented and not perceived. Such a metaphysic permits Aristotelian biology, in conjunction with maximality theories of nature, to imply the efficient cause of a dimensional emanation of the material cause of matter, to lead to the final cause of growth in respectively appropriate formal design. Galen Strawson outlines what he determines to be micropsychism. He defines the weak thesis preliminary to the strong thesis of overt panpsychism as the admission that at least some ultimates must be experiential. Should one be willing to accept that some ultimates are experiential, where is the gap in logic in finding that all ultimates may be experiential? Where life may be reduced, experience is irreducible. The prime reasons for denying such a consideration lie in what he determines to be physicsalism, the view wielding a religious fervor that all of reality may be described by physics at its core. But this is not true. Experience, conscious experience, feeling, and many other phenomena are not describable by physics. So why should one not consider replacing the thesis that physical stuff is non-experiential with experience as a real concrete phenomena, and every concrete phenomena is physical? Effectively, this will change little more than accepting the fruits of firing neurons into the domain of conversation. Physicalism. Physicalism is a 20th century philosophy of mind born of the Vienna Circle. While it was originally intended to indicate each statement is in accordance with some physical statement, it is here utilized in application of a positivist metaphysical thesis declaring statements of the nature of the cosmos. It is, however, apparent neuroscience cannot account for consciousness. Physicalism renders an incomplete picture of the observed experience of life. Therefore, another cosmology must be assessed in our solution. The panpsychic blend of structural physicalism and consciousness characteristic of panpsychism permits metaphysical structures in the current version of model philosophy, which has outlived the application of natural theistic laws. Supervenience physicalism fails in 4 specific respects. The twin worlds thought experiment defies the laws of logic and does not permit a sound theory of supervenience. The modal status problem indicates the version of our world in duplicate may not indicate a psychological copy. If this is the case, the entirety of the structure does not indicate a cosmos true to physicalism. Conceivability arguments may reveal further issues as we may consider pure experience or epiphenomenal ectoplasm in a duplicate world. This indicates by matter of conceivability, possibility reasoning, physicalism is not such a possible response to the nature of reality. Finally, the conceivability of blockers in the supervening chains hinder the physicalist response of philosophers. The distinction between philosophical process of phenomenology and the abstraction of the scientists is perhaps the clearest junction showing what may constitute the modern supervenience physicalism view held by most physicalists today. Implicit metaphysical bias, which eliminates possibilities of conceptualizing reality, disrupts implicit prioritization and views of mind and reality. Modern scientism assumes metaphysical standpoints of the self and quells expansive growth or henosis and such spirituality through fear. Exponential growth of self reveals itself as apparent in panpsychism as opposed to a vertical emergent property latent in strong emergence. Quelling such growth perpetuates sterilized secularism and herd morality in an era of state totality. Another system is mandatory in this application because consciousness is not yet explained. Responses from philosophers such as Daniel Dennett that the China brain thought experiment does indeed indicate consciousness in a functionalist universe are inadequate. For sciences are very far indeed from such formulated answers, just as they always have been. Structure as logic. Arguments for most theories are constrained by the limits of language. where we should be looking to the emergence of life as it appears to us in natural form. Famed logician Bertrand Russell claims the universe reveals itself to us in mathematics, and we are at fault where it does not appear to do so. It does not matter what is north of the North Pole, or that there are as many even numbers as there are whole numbers. These methods of othering in theory are mere epistemological distraction, only serving to separate the living organism from the creator with which it may be in constant union. This is a category mistake, for the core of this discussion is metaphysics. Most of the concepts which formulate the Western mind may be displayed by graphing a Vesica Pisces and speaking the measurements thereof in Hebrew. What room for debate and thought experiments may contend with the mathematical graphing of a circle? The quiet truth is that these have been the musings of Plato and Aristotle since the construction of Hebrew temples in the Egyptian Ennead, as well as the novenary construction of the Pyramid of Giza. How much weight can objections hold when the very decimal system in use today lies congruent with the concepts of our mind's mother tongue? The absoluteness of mathematics is the single abstraction which requires no abstraction, the one observation of reality which requires no measure of itself. The lessons of the Academy may well agree, is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics still hold for the little Aristotles running amok with the Neoplatonic conceptions of reality, implying a great chain of being with limited experiential ultimates. Considering creation as the Ford emanating from the void echoes the very metaphysical structure of the cosmogonic myths of Elohim in Hebrew, Nun of Egypt, and the Tao to Chinese mystics. Simple acceptance of this mathematical truth opens oneself to the truths of Stoic self-writing, also Foucault's Hypomnemata, which secularist Foucault holds paramount as an alternative to anchor in an all-encompassing world. Consistent with Kierkegaard's valuing faith over reason in his analysis of God asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, Jung holds faith may be an alternative lifeline away from the power strings which may muddle with one's reason in the play of man. Some authors consider this the core of Horus and Neterism, Ketch Oltani, or a true believer to the Dena'ina people, and an objective union in Jewish studies. The Book of the Way reads, and yet this ineffable Tao is the source of all spirit and matter. Expressing itself, it is the mother of all created things. Yet these two things, matter and spirit, so different in nature, have the same origin. This unity is the mystery of mysteries and the gateway to spirituality. I've devised a short thought experiment, which just basically makes people hopefully question power structures. I call it the Temple of Jerusalem thought experiment. Imagine we're first century Israelites in the heart of Jerusalem. We're loyal to and act in loving support of our religious center. The epicenter of this is the Holy of Holies, housing the Ark of the Covenant in the Temple of Jerusalem, with all the glory of King Solomon's majesty. Suppose, however, heretics begin to question this God, these teachings. They begin to critique and analyze the very theory and practice, the law and praxis under which our society is run. The error of these assumptions hinges on the unknowing of the inner rings of the temple. The Holy of Holies is seen by one man once per year. What inspires these orders? How can we even know an ark is there? This ripples into the priest's direction informing Pharisees, who act in tandem with the political arm of this country. For they are informed by the secret religious elite. We may apply this image to any and all post-colonial assessments of the Western power structure. For all we know, every perception based upon emotional or spiritual platform is an inclination implanted by an outer ripple, created by an inner cabal of the power elite. In this scenario, our assessments become little more than guided observation under a jaded context out of ignorance, within the unknown unknowns into which we are cast. Further, and more importantly, the truth and relevance behind that which is actually pertinent is kept the secret. Like Nietzsche's herd, our eyes are upside down alongside our morals. So much for the advent of language, for the true contingencies upon which this world structure operates are evasive to all. They are the most elusive to the scholar who is saturated in the system of disinformation. Reflexivity. The only conceptual method to determine real from illusory is to attach to that which is real a reflexive property, a so-called presence to itself, which humans use to identify their personhood. It is precisely this realness which is utilized to distinguish a real individual from an illusory apparition. While this is not specifically thought, the teleological psychological processes towards an end indicate intentional, self-directional, and conal properties. This person is self-activated and oriented to person, place, and time through introspection in a manner which an illusion, say a hologram, cannot. Matthews says to ascribe a comparable self-presence or reflexive interiority to matter generally seems to be the only means available to us by which we might escape from the conceptual impasse of the appearance-reality distinction. This is a means unavailable to materialists, with the denial of mind-like properties to matter. It follows that only panpsychists who are indeed prepared to ascribe mind-like properties to matter can solve this conceptual anomaly of the appearance-reality distinction at the heart of materialism. This self-becoming is a core problem for physicalism. For veridical partitions of logic, the distinction and description conveying an organism is individually and also totally a sum of atoms, molecules, and cells, while also remaining a single unitary substance, flail in a sea of unintentionality when observed in the confines of a void emanating pure mathematics as totalities of atoms, molecules, and cells. For the analysis of a cell may mimic the partition of a Fibonacci sequence as a subset of a whole number pattern, or the groupings of multiple sections of a shape. This void questions of social groups supervening on living things, triumphing over cells, for all of reality is simply of itself so. The real world is just poosh, says Alan Watts. These are not questions of a dynamic reality which only appears static because we observe with the seemingly stable intake of our eyes. Russell's concerns of logic being utilized to reinforce epiphanies of mysticism do not need to be cited here. For panpsychism accounts for the conal shape of the universe in the Big Bang vanishing from a point in the lower third dimension. This follows deGrasse Tyson's logic of 4D reality stemming from a grounded lower third dimension. These may indicate objective truth to personal truths and narrative. Theories of a warmer, expanding universe merge panpsychism with the Big Bang. Here, the Big Bang becomes the direction of telos for such beings. The materialist will object, human becoming may be explained by biology and psychology. The materialist psychologist may even consider the musings of personal activation or a conscious carbon parent to be indicative of psychosis, and this personification of the universe to be no more than psychological projection. But the panpsychist will reply, structure is biology. This is where a bodhisattva comes in. A realized person must go back into the world because they understand this void is only the source of being, not the fruit of the tree of life. Even ancient secular myths of mental processes such as the tale of Narcissus back up this human problem of ego. This inward reflection, also championed by monist Bertrand Russell, mimics comedic concepts of a man becoming. Incorporating this may free one from the confines of the physical. These may be used in conjunction with Zhujian, a Chinese term for nature, meaning of itself so. In Zen, realizing you're liberated from the past, a different person than you were 5 minutes ago. Normandy Ellis translates of the Egyptian god Ra. What has form is part of Ra, and also of Osiris, O infinite form of being. These mirror Gnostic concepts of a higher mathematically grounded atom wrestling with the confines of an impure reality. Here, the gnosis of sentience is premier only after faith, for faith and belief implies union with one's very existence. The emergence of life from non-life indicates there is much more to what is understood by the hard sciences regarding the nature of reality as we experience it. Here I'm referring to abiogenesis or abiogenesis. In such a sense, vertical partitions of life in an organism do not apply. All is merely dissection of creation of life from the infinite. This is displayed in the monadology descendant of Spinoza's studies of the Hebrew Ein Sof, spiritual being prior to any self-manifestation. Utilizing these metaphysics, these theological arguments of prior cause only pertain to the properly dimensioned matter in such a diffracted light, as they all resonate from a monistic source of energy. Strawson cites the roots of Leibnizian monadological analysis inherent to the West today, and one may consider a monistic metaphysical reality should they accept his thesis that the physicalism entails panpsychism. For mathematics of form from a void trump veridical partitions of mathematics in a higher dimension projection with telos and intentionality. In this application, physics is but the relational network of a scholasticized theology. In considering our post-colonial thought experiment, why should we believe that the institution of the sciences declares to the public as fact? Much of the rest of the world does not adhere to these rigid physicalist views. Do we even understand how Taoist China conducts and regards science? Do we have access to the studies of the Hadron Collider? One may consider why such theories are oppressed from the perspective of power, and subjective citizens are not open to them. There's an entire post-colonial philosophy derivative of Frantz Fanon entitled self-location, a kind of response in the organism embodied to the environment. How would this be possible and also prevalent in long-standing native ways of being, were the world not minded? For there are multiple cultures who ascribe consciousness to inanimate objects or historical heirlooms. Dinaina ideas of Bagesh and Bagesha are basically good and bad juju residing within an object of importance. The ego self seems to extend through the basic self into the world when this is possible, and panpsychism accounts for this extension by virtue of a minded matter. Diverse methods of reasoning, such as Foucault's self-writing, Hapamnemata, as well as Gnostic being in the works of Edward Scher, both account for such panpsychic experiential phenomena in different ways. Where Foucault holds self-writing becomes a kind of opposite to social society to anchor an individual. Scher holds one's pre-birth life force rages against and then through this lesser emanation of life. A materialist should merely abstract forms from such thought. The biologist may account for the strong hereditary will of particular youths, and a psychologist may regard the mental beliefs of Stoic reflection. However, even a skeptic may account for the illimitable beneath conflation of will, intent, intellect, mindfulness, and scientific insight of a theoretical virtuoso. So why can one not equally ascribe this to the structure as a whole? Where a system of logic may fail in conflation with nature, the very essences and interrelations of the Imago Dei, the image of God, may be better tailored to mimic nature. These systems are more evolved systems of Hume's sentimentalism. Telos. The combination problem, as so espoused by philosophers such as Chalmers, is easily the biggest problem to panpsychism. When considering how an element may have element being, and its larger system, the molecule, may have a different and higher molecular being, we beg the dilemma of conveying how level 1 element reaches level 2 molecule. In terms we may best apply, this may be illustrated in comprehending how our central nervous system collaborates with other systems in our body to reach standard human consciousness. However, is this telos in panpsychism some positive magical tissue, a term borrowed from Daniel Dennett, for the combination problem? Does panpsychism not hinge on a higher order theory, which conveniently solves its own core fault? Numerous theories, advances in computing, and scientific discoveries speak to the collaborative levels of analysis capable in nature, all existing as a singular thing. Panpsychism purports something very similar to strong emergence. As described by George Ellis in Closer to Truth, strong emergence, a form of top-down and bottom-up mind and matter hierarchical interaction, which declares properly structured form, acts together from the ground up, and the mind governs this from above. The main difference for panpsychism is the directionality is all upward bound and caused by mind intrinsic to the whole system. Physics holds one system may be described in many ways, and tearing apart a whole ecology piece by piece destroys the cohesiveness of the system's totality. Applying introspective consciousness to matter permits purposeful growth in event memory creating matter. Perceptual consciousness is not what is implied here, for the only consideration for the psychism theories is a minimal consciousness. Physicists, Buddhists, and biologists alike say there is must be a core level to reality. Physics tells us matter can only be described in relation. The issue lies in our hallucinated perspective and method of description. We are bound by words from one level of analysis. There's no need for magic tissue with panpsychism, the only practical option which accounts for growth and expansive properties of nature. Strauss reinforces with his interpretation Spinoza finds each self as a node in a network. Spinoza, though because he denies freedom of the will, is more thorough than Descartes in his commitment to naturalism. Our perception is distorted. Maximality of systems in accordance with scientific efficiency mimics Spinoza's rationalist natural saturation principle of an efficient, self-explanatory universe. Information theory is providing sound evidence for matter as being, consciousness as information, and knowledge as a sort of purposeful growth in accordance with Solace's entropy, dictating the energy of one apparition must equal another. Gross misconceptions of the world may be shown in assumptions inherent to Newtonian mechanics. According to analytic metaphysics, holes don't exist and mountains are episodically perceived mounds of risen earth. The whole earth is in constant flux in response to itself. Watts notes an important distinction in which part of you decides when a decision is made. This implies the saturation principle, a mythological cosmogony of a world balanced on turtles upon turtles, as the physical structure inherent to panpsychism. It's turtles all the way down, says Rebecca Goldstein. In other words, the world is reason upon reasons. Issues with emergence. Strong emergence holds a lack of evidence against panpsychism in what has been discovered of the telos, intentionality and causality of physics mirroring panpsychic theories. What happens to the first level as matter turns to the second level, considering the jump of a layer in strong emergence is not explained by the rules of physics. The bedrock foundational layer is described by such rules which form the foundation of higher levels in chemistry, then biology. However, this jump is not accounted for with telos. Strong emergence has the right ideas, however, panpsychism provides more accurate causal implications in accordance with the individual elements and relations of a cosmological system imitating nature. Emergent dualism, the theory which states mental substances are constituted by properly organized matter, does not hold in accordance with the best of mathematics in these cosmogonic myths. For a circle is the action of the inaction of the void of existence. Symbols would need to reflect as a kind of imprint from the void, a printing press requiring an amorphous nothing for the buoyancy within emergent dualism. Manly P. Hall says of Albert Pike, what type of material would be therefore most likely to be locked in an enigma to be concealed behind some form? The answer would have to be that it is some kind of knowledge pertaining to things not to be literally seen, not to be factually examined, and not available in their full and pure substance. All symbol ends in the fact that the symbol is a veil over the face of God. Theories of emergent abiogenesis parallel emergent layers of modern models in philosophy and physics, and the dilemma is the same for both. We do not understand how these systems go up a layer. This is quite the same eternally contested problem of raising a level that a theologian receives when accounting for God. Panpsychism accounts for this tissue within the conscious nature of matter, albeit at a relatively low conscious form of experience. Intuitive activation.
You have a couple minutes.
Last paragraph. How does one explain the mind-like processes of the intuition character trait versus the sensing process? While mentioned as Jung was informing the CIA on the parapsychology which would come to found PSYOP of the Civil War, there's no clear definition for why certain people come to the conclusive results from the appearance of stimuli, while others merely sense their presence. This is activation of the psyche looking inward into the dormant state of energy. The words intuition and panpsychism are not descriptions of the process. They are observational abstractions from the conglomerative consciousness of sentient beings in the situations which are presented. Scientists write this form of energy off to chance as observed under statistical methods. These scenarios are outside of statistical methods. However, their presence is described by the virtue of their behavior. People hate problems they cannot formulate, and Jung declares, real activation of time and space through the psyche. That's the packet. And that is where the light has made evident.
Bravo. Thank you very much. So we've got a good 6 to 8 minutes or so for questions. I know some of you are working on exactly the same problems.
I don't have any questions, Keldon, but nice job. And I want a copy of that paper so I can read it a little more slowly. You spoke fine. I just would like to read it for myself because I'm not familiar with some of those concepts.
I have like 48 references. Like,
yeah.
Yeah, that happened.
I'm wondering if there's a relationship between entropy and panpsychism. You touched on it just briefly, but I've been fascinated with the idea that entropy is kind of this will that where did our other student? Oh, there he is. Yeah. So there is a relationship, I think, between the two of those. And I remember thinking that entropy just means everything slows down and so on. But there's an interesting book by Carl Sagan's son, Dorian, Into the Cool, where he argues that the evolution of life and consciousness is actually increasing the tempo of entropy. I'm wondering if you think there's any, if that touches the theme of your paper.
I think that's entirely possible. Regarding this, I mostly think of chaos mathematics as it occurs in dynamic systems. We can't predict small amounts of chaos, but there's a kind of homeostasis that occurs at a certain point. And I guess if you had all these things happening in tandem, the universe would indeed expand. And that's where it gets interesting, because then these cosmogonic myths of particularly Hinduism comes to mind. What is it, the Naraka, the last stage of Earth being the shortest, would be accurate.
I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he doesn't believe, chaos is actually order if we just step back far enough.
Yeah.
And that,
Alan Watts talks about that, the warp and woof and different levels of analysis. Yeah, that's right up my ballpark.
Yeah, it might look like chaos up close, but when you step back, it becomes order, and order directed by entropy, because entropy seems to force things to evolve the way they do. But that's just a theory. So
a pretty thick theory there.
Yeah. My recommendation though is don't buy his books. They're online for free. Yeah. So don't do that. Awesome. Fortunately, when you get into a professorship of some sort, you end up with people like this sending them to you for free.
It's a nice perk. I don't.
It is. Stephen Wolfram.
You have a question, Ishik?
Yeah, I mostly want to get your opinion on like, I don't know how to word this, but almost like alternative ideas of knowledge. So in the beginning of your paper, I was trying to get some like Feyerabend vibes, like very much like trying to like, I'm just wondering how we might be able to kind of understand panpsychism without, I guess trying to understand it in its sort of feels, I suppose, trying to like that sort of like not ethical, but like this internal feeling of panpsychism or internal feel of like the Tao, or just in this internal, like, just, I almost want to say faith, not really faith, just this internal drive to discover it. I was just wondering your opinions on like, I guess the value of that sort of like, I'm not sure if I'm making this kind of question very clear, but this sort of just feeling of something there, I suppose, rather than just like logical like arguments, but instead it's just like this feeling. What's the value of that, do you think?
I wish I could have thrown more poetry in here. I threw in an excerpt of the first poem of the Tao, and the Corpus Hermeticum is beautiful when it comes to this. But there's a really good argument that I cited against, what is it? Sean Carroll, it's a physicist and a Buddhist arguing basically. And they kind of both say the same thing, just in different terms. So these arguments of math and hard sciences, I mean, they're codified in the Bible, right? It's just how you interpret it. So I think there's a beauty in the symmetry implied to something like this. Thinking that, not so different from the occasionalism that we've learned from Dr. Potter, that there might be a literal constant mind interacting as I speak to you right now in real time. And we actually have some very, very brilliant people finding this. And then kind of the question I was asking when you were presenting, what's the limit to that? If it's not a Gnostic reality, but it's a Hermetic reality, and I heard someone mention individuation earlier, and you can increase that individuation without the inflation of the ego, you can quite literally become closer to the life will that is around us. So honestly, that's a big drive for my life. And
I mean, that's very Hegelian. So it goes through, yeah.
Yeah.
Would you consider President Trump the Weltgeist, at least during the 4 years of his term in office?
I'm sorry, consider him the what?
The Weltgeist. You know, the world spirit. The Napoleon on a white horse.
I know Zeitgeist. I haven't heard that one.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's more than that.
He saw Napoleon riding by on this is Hegel. He saw Napoleon riding by in Jena on a white horse, and he described him as, there goes that world soul on a white horse. You know, the Weltgeist.
I think
there's a really good image that was presented in the book that I read, and it was talking about an octave break and the metaphysical implications of an octave breaking. And that's a really interesting thought. We like to think that what we have is a totality, and it might be, as Spinoza would say, the causa sui, the cause of itself in its material forms, but physics points to antimatter, and we don't understand formulas and dark energy. Why are we thinking, even on a very solipsistic level, solipsism, how do I know that this is not a simulation? And that doesn't have to be a negative thing. So I really just think we should dispel our very egocentric monkey thinking. We know very little, and the more we know, we realize that we know even less.
Scott?
Yeah, yeah.
So in your paper, you mentioned about Strawson's argument that physicalism entails panpsychism. Okay. And so, you know, as you were reading your paper, I was thinking about Berkeley's idealism. I wasn't thinking about materialism, right? I mean, I don't see a real big distinction between materialism and physicalism. So, I mean, your paper's interesting. Would you say that you agree with Strawson's argument that physicalism entails panpsychism? I mean, before I heard your paper, I wouldn't even think it would be possible to logically construct a materialist account of panpsychism. And that's why I found so interesting about your paper. But then as I was listening, I was like, does he think that you can construct a materialistic account of panpsychism? I mean, I'm just curious. Do you think that's possible?
I think that's actually kind of what I'm implying a little bit.
Yeah, I thought so. I just want to be sure. Okay, that's a real adventurous journey.
It has been.
I do think that's what you're trying to do. And I do think that Strawson does give you kind of like a path to follow, but you really are trying to bring the whole of physics into it on top of, his argument, which is, just a philosophical argument. So I'm kind of excited by your paper. I appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you.
I got to see P.F. Strawson at the University of Pennsylvania once. Just saying, that was fun.
How was
Thank
he?
you, Captain. I appreciate it. Bravo.
Yeah.
The one I really enjoyed seeing was Quine, but that was just, I'm pointing out I'm the oldest person here, I think.
And seniority rules.
Keldon, did you read Tink's article on the consciousness of rocks, and did it relate to what you were studying?
I have not yet. I have a huge list of things I've found in the last few months. But funny enough, I was telling my stepdad about what I planned for this paper, and he pointed out a Bible verse where Christ says something like, if that rock could speak, it would shout out. And he just said that offhand. He has a great biblical knowledge, but I found it very interesting that he cited a very core, like he kind of understands panpsychism just offhand. It's very interesting.
Well, Tink talks about the consciousness of rocks. He talks about how we consider rocks inert material, and the Native Americans consider rocks to be the eldest relatives and have the most wisdom, and they don't actually need to move because they already have all the wisdom that they need. But it's a really interesting read. So I'd be curious to see how it relates to panpsychism, actually. And your idea of physicalism being panpsychism.
I want to read that paper too. I think maybe we just need to make this a discussion group. I think there's a few issues to work out here. Yeah, thank you very much. Greta, perhaps you want to take this conversation in a slightly different direction. How are you doing?
Yeah, my paper is definitely in a very different direction. I might need a second because I'm on my phone right now and I want to switch to my computer to present easier. So I'm going to leave really quick, but I'll be back.
We have many seconds.
Sounds good.
Good. We'll see you soon.
I'm feeling guilty because I've moved rocks. Quite a few. Now I'm thinking, oh my goodness, they had all that wisdom and then they were in a perfect place and I moved them.
But no one said they had a will.
Maybe they wanted me to move them. That's why on moving rocks, that's why I brought out everybody recognizes this guy, right?
Is that a gremlin?
I think it's Yoda.
Oh no,
I'm joking.
No, this is Yoda.
Okay.
But is it like a Benjamin Franklin Yoda? Those facial features are.
Well, it says Star Wars on it, so it's actually official toy or stuffed animal from. And I spent a whole $5 on it in Las Vegas, so. But there's a new show with a baby one of these, in The Mandalorian. Is that little one supposed to be Yoda when he's younger or something?
Oh, don't tell me.
Oh, I was gonna spoil it, but
no, please. Sorry, you'll have to find that out for yourself, okay? Or give me several months. I didn't have time to watch the show. Well, I'm sorry I cut off our conversation now. Apologies.
Oh, I thought, we're missing the person who's speaking next?
She's coming back on a different device. we're going to get a computational representational phenomenology of visual perception, maybe a little more AI, computational brain. By the way, if any of you are interested in philosophy, just know how much literature there is on these issues. Many of you have seen that already in Minds and Machines, but Joel, isn't it painful to try to like carve that line, the didactic line through the literature, right? I came from a PhD program, it was half philosophy and neuropsychology, and all the conversations essentially teamed up with the medical school and neuroscience. We're thinking in terms of maybe not panpsychism, that word was not utterable, I think, in my program, but everything else.
I think in Ron's paper on Thursday evening, he mentioned about 15 books, and I don't believe I read a single one of them. So I've got a lot of homework to do just to catch up on the conversation everyone else was having. That's why the only question I asked was he a Pepsi person or a Coke person? And that joke fell so flat. Nothing's worse than a flat soda joke. And I can see it's still pretty flat.
Well, I'm curious, what did you think about his talk, William?
Well, I was fascinated because of course, this has been a major topic in so many venues for the last couple of, well, many years, really. And I remember in college reading Dinesh D'Souza's book, The End of Racism. And I thought that was pretty persuasive. And I've been convinced it's a cultural issue, especially when biologists tell us there's only one race, the human race. So this idea that racism is a social construct, depending on the culture, and that breaks it up into subcultures and everything else. So you can imagine, you know, how it operates in a society in New York versus, well, and different neighborhoods, et cetera. And language, how language is part of it. You can tell where someone is from just by hearing their voice. So if all of a sudden I started talking like this, you could figure East Coast or something, right? You know, should I keep talking, or am I entertaining you now? I can do.
Joel, were you going to jump in earlier?
No, I don't think so. I nodded my head in response to what you're saying about the PhilMind field and how much there is to cover. But yeah, I didn't really have much to add to that. Yeah.
I do have a recommendation for people that are just beginning to build their libraries, and that is don't buy everything you want. Try to just check them out of the library, because then you could give them back. Because if you just keep buying them, you eventually end up living in a garage that looks like this. You know, that's just all books.
That's impressive.
Welcome back, Greta.
Thanks.
Greta Smith will be presenting today about a title that we were already enjoying, Computational Representational Phenomenology of Visual Perception. Thank you.
Yes, okay, thank you. I just want to say beforehand, I have been editing and re-editing this paper like up until very recently. And there's one section that I realized I didn't fully complete. So I am going to leave out a small part of it just because it won't make sense. Otherwise, yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry. Let me see.
Very good. I just made you front and center, if that's okay with you.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that's fine. No worries. I am reading off my computer, so I'm not going to be able to see it anyway, but I can see you in the corner. So if I'm like going over time, you can.
Okay, good.
Let me. Okay. So my paper is on the computational representational phenomenology of visual perception. And I'm just gonna read it through, and then if it didn't make any sense, you can ask me to clarify. In this paper, I will argue that the mediation of sense perception, specifically vision, through the physical body means that perception can reasonably be seen as a computational process resulting in a manufactured representation. The goal is to create an explanation essentially analogous to the computational representational theory of thought that accounts for sense perception, a computational representational theory of visual perception, so to speak. I will use examples of scientifically observed phenomena to support this argument, primarily focusing on the phenomenon of transsaccadic representation. I will argue that visual perception, i.e. the phenomena we see, can be understood as a representation facilitated by computational processes in a manner similar to the understanding of mental activity advanced by the computational representational theory of thought. The theory addresses the creation of the visual phenomenological field as a whole prior to any inferences that may be made about what sorts of external world objects are represented within it. Throughout this paper, I refer to perception, perceptual cognition, and metacognition. For clarity's sake, I want to begin by specifying the exact way in which I am using each term. Perception here refers explicitly to the reception, and intake of sensory input. Perceptual cognition refers to making sense of the input, inferring from it, and making judgments about it. Metacognition refers to all further thought processes above and beyond perceptual cognition. Occasionally, I use the term cognition independently, which encompasses both perceptual and metacognition. The distinction between perception and cognition can most concisely be summed up in the fact that during cognitive processes, the condition of the object of thought does not affect or constrain the way in which it can be thought about. Okay. Phenomenological traditions are perhaps the most suited to addressing the problem of perception, given that they are responsible for introducing the phenomenon of perception itself, separated from the external world it perceives, as an object of study. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that empirical approaches to perception, concerned with knowing rather than sensing, fail to account for the phenomenal field, despite that being the very lens through which they themselves must inherently operate. Sensory perception, he writes, quote, is that vital communication with the world which makes it present as a familiar setting of our life, end quote. The way in which we experience the world, the experience itself, must be considered separately from the qualities inherent in that which we are experiencing. This does not render empirical or naturalistic accounts false, however. It merely points out that they fail to acknowledge their presuppositions. Calling attention to the phenomenal field as an area worthy of attention and study entails an acknowledgement of the sense of reality involved in taking something to be real. The necessity of the phenomenological account to supplement the worldview of the empirical account is clear, but the inverse is arguably true as well. The necessity of the empirical approach to the functioning of the phenomenological approach becomes evident when we consider the concept of perceptual possibilities, i.e. what we perceive to be a logical possible subsequent perception to our current one. Obviously, we cannot have perceptual possibilities without previous observed experiences of correlated chains of events. In this case, we are concerned with the phenomena involved in sight, our visual experiences, the way things appear to us. My central argument revolves around the phenomenal field, but addresses it from an empirical stance. By understanding that the applied phenomenological and empirical approaches work together inseparably and in service of one another, we can move forward in explaining, at least in part, the creation of the phenomenal field by the empirical world. Okay, computational representational theory of thought. Functionalist theories of mind hold that mental states are defined by their causal relations to one another. Within the functionalist paradigm, one theory for explaining the mind's ability to function as a causal network is the computational representational theory of thought, which holds that the processes carried out in the mind are essentially analogous to those carried out in a digital computer. The mind is seen as software operating on the hardware of the brain, manipulating tokens of information in some form of processing language unique to thought. Jerry Fodor, one of the theory's most prominent defenders, notes that many areas of research and study pertaining to cognition, communication, intelligence, semantics, and theories of mind presuppose such a mechanism. Objections to this theory generally come in the form of appeals to intentionality and meaning, neither of which appear to affect the application of the computational representational framework to perception itself. These qualities are the province of thought specifically, and my goal here is not to address thought qua cognition in any way, but simply to provide a mechanical account of perceptual phenomena. While such arguments do pose potential problems for CRTT proper, they do not preclude the framework from satisfactorily explaining visual experience. Assigning meaning to sensory experience is not the job of the sense organs themselves. This is not a feature of perception per se, but of perceptual cognition. CRTT serves only as a framework for the theory I will present, not as a necessary co-requisite. Okay, sorry, my mouth is getting dry. All right. Summary of visual transduction. A very brief, very simplified summary of the physiological processes behind vision as they are understood through a contemporary scientific lens is warranted here. Ancient Greek thinkers such as Ptolemy and Euclid believed that sight operated through the emission of light rays from the eye. The Muslim scholar Ibn al-Haytham was responsible for the reversal of this theory into the one we still hold to this day, establishing that light was not emitted by the eyes, but reflected onto the eye by the objects seen. When light waves make contact with the eye, the lens of the eye causes the waves to converge onto a single focal point, the fovea, at the back of the eye on the retina. Photons activate photoreactive pigments in the retina, which in turn activate photoreceptor cells, causing a chain of molecular activities, a broad generalization, but the specifics of the process make no substantive difference for my argument that transduces the visual stimulus into a corresponding electrical stimulus. The electrical stimulus then travels through the optic nerve into the brain, where the totality of stimuli representing the current visual field are synthesized into one image, the visual phenomenal perception. This summary is extremely crude in terms of a scientific explanation of vision, but for our current philosophical purposes, it is certainly sufficient. We can already see a glimpse of the representational nature of visual perception even here, and the fact that the two categories of photoreceptor cells, rods and cones, contribute different facets of the visual field. The former is sensitive to low light, the latter is responsible for color, and it falls on the brain to synthesize these disparate aspects into a cohesive visual field. Computational representational theory of perception. Given the points established above, we can now move on to their synthesis, the computational representational account of phenomenal perception, visual perception specifically. At this point, we can see that the process of vision is intuitively analogous with the process of computation. The hardware of the visual perception computer, as viewed through this theory, begins with the eyeball and extends through the optic nerve into the visual processing area of the brain in the occipital lobe. The software is constituted in the aspects of the hardware that cause it to perform the way it does, namely the molecules involved in the transduction of light information into an electrical impulse. Light making contact with the eye is the input of information from an outside source. The process of transduction is the transitional process of computation, and the resulting phenomenal perception, i.e. visual representation, is the computer's displayed output. It is important to specify that the output here refers explicitly to the perception itself as it is presented to us, irrespective of and before any inferences, judgments, or extrapolations we, i.e. our capabilities of thought in whatever form they take, might make regarding it. The activity accounted for in what I will refer to as the computational representational theory of perception, or CRTP for short, begins at the moment light makes contact with the eye and ends at the moment that the resulting visual phenomenon is displayed. We see that vision is, at best, an imperfect representation of whatever characteristics seem to be inhering in the thing we perceive. Two people can receive the same visual stimulus and experience markedly different visual phenomena. Disorders of the eye have direct consequences for the perceptual phenomena. Do we say that a colorblind person's perception of a given object and a person with the full spectrum of normal color vision's perception of the same object differ because of some difference in the inherent qualities of the object? Of course not, because to say that two different colors simultaneously inhere in the exact same substance would be absurd. Sorry. The light wavelengths reflected from the object of perception at any given moment are identical no matter who is looking at them. yet they can yield incongruous representations due to abnormality in the software or hardware of the visual computer. Nearsightedness, farsightedness, and astigmatism affect the phenomenal field in similar ways. The shape of the eye causes the light to be refracted in abnormal ways, resulting in distorted perceptual representations that are a result of the condition of the visual apparatus itself rather than the condition of the object being perceived. Transsaccadic representation. In the scientific world, there are many observed phenomena that we can point to as evidence for a representational account of perception. I previously addressed visual imbalances and disorders including colorblindness, myopia and hyperopia, near and farsightedness, and astigmatism. However, there is also evidence for the representational nature of vision that can be observed in a perfectly healthy eye, inherent features of the visual processing system, not disruption of usual conditions. The primary example I will focus on here is that of saccadic masking, also called transsaccadic representation. Saccades are the small darting movement of the eye as it shifts focus from point to point, occurring around 3 times a second and alternating with periods of stillness called fixations. It is during these brief fixations that we obtain a clear picture of the world, or in other words, a stable phenomenal perception. However, if the process of vision were truly unmediated, our perception would blur slightly during each saccade. Given that our perception remains stable, we can assume that some mechanism maintains a representation of the previous fixation during each saccade, then allows the eye to refocus at the next fixation. This is all well and good, but why then do we not experience a jump in focus from one fixation to the next? Clearly, something allows us to experience a smooth transition between focal points, rather than reducing vision to a rapid slideshow of refocused phenomenal perceptions. The task at hand, then, is finding an explanation for our experience of phenomenal stability during these movements. Explaining the literal physiological mechanics behind this stability is a task that falls to neuroscientists and has been the object of extensive study, but from a philosophical perspective, we can reasonably consider this evidence against a direct theory of perception and in support of a representational one. Once the input has been computed and the output has been represented, the representation can then be briefly sustained by the brain, irrespective of the physical objects in the visual field. Objections. In terms of responding to objections, a significant advantage that the computational representational theory of perception, or CRTP, has over the CRTT is, as touched on earlier, the fact that it does not have to account for intentionality. Applying the framework of computation and representation to pure phenomenal content is much simpler than applying it to cognitive content. Being that I do not think there is anything terribly controversial about the structure of my general argument within the paradigms in which it operates, the major objections facing the CRTP are those that disagree with its fundamental premises. The most natural objections to this theory would be those that discount the notion of perception as representation altogether. Common non-representational theories of perception include the sense datum theory and the naive realist theory, both of whose adherents would reject the computational representational view of perception on the basis that perception should not be thought of as representation at all. Another major category of objections to this theory comes in the form of phenomenological skepticism. Among the most prominent phenomenological skeptics is Daniel Dennett, who denounces the entire phenomenological project as, quote, a discipline with no methods, no data, no results, no future, no promise, concluding that it will, quote, remain a fantasy, unquote. I cannot presume to convince an objector who rejects the premises of consciousness, representation, and phenomenological investigation wholesale. Oftentimes, distinctions are drawn between representational content and phenomenal character, with the implication that the latter can exist in an experience without the former. I fundamentally disagree with this because my view is that experience is representation. Phenomenal character is representational character. Conclusion. Something to note about this model is that while it is patterned off of a specific theory of thought, it is compatible with virtually any theory of thought. Earlier, I mentioned arguments. Actually, I didn't mention arguments earlier. I'm sorry, that was the part I cut out. That connect the product of the CRTP with higher order processing on the model of the original CRTT, a logical and satisfactory combination, but the former does not necessitate the latter. Any theory of thought that allows for perception as representation can utilize the CRTP as an explanatory framework for the creation of perceptual phenomena and offer its own account of the subsequent perceptual cognition and metacognition associated with said phenomena. I believe this model can be easily transposed to all forms of sensory perception. I've chosen to illustrate it with the example of vision due to its status as the primary sensory modality through which humans seek to understand the external world, and the many scientific examples of perceptual irregularity available to me as direct supporting evidence for the representational nature of visual perception. But the same framework can be slightly modified to accommodate the physical processes of any given sense modality. The physiological fact of the matter, as the contemporary scientific community understands it, is that all sense perception must be transduced into electrical impulses in order to be delivered to and processed by the brain, a process very intuitively parallel with the translation of input into binary code performed by any digital computer. This model strengthens the view that perception is a matter of representation and provides a sketch for understanding visual perception in a sense that synthesizes the phenomenological and empirical approaches. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo. Thank you very much, Greta. Who would like to start us off with an initial question?
I'm sure that there were parts of it that didn't make sense because I've been editing this so much that I don't know if my own arguments make sense anymore, but yeah.
I could have a question, Greta. That was a very valiant attempt to get a really complicated field. I was just going to recommend you look again at Dennett, because I think that Dennett, what he's arguing against phenomenology as the end of it all to explain, for instance, what you're trying to explain, perception. He's considering that phenomenology should be just one more piece of data when we do the what he calls the heterophenomenological approach, which would include, as I said, just the phenomenology of perception as just one datum, one piece of data. But again, good job. It's very difficult stuff, and you did a very good job in presenting it. So
yeah, thank you. That's a good point. I do need to look again at what I took that from, because I think it wasn't even written. It was a transcript of like an interview or something. And so I might have taken what he was saying out of context. So
there's
I will look.
Really good little book that he came up, I think about 10 years ago, that's called Sweet Dreams. Mm-hmm. And there he goes on into kind of like a very popular way of putting his point against phenomenology. But I think that once you read that, you realize he's quite agreeable to what you're saying. He's just saying that the idea that we should take the phenomenon of perception as a single end of it all analysis and description of what's going on, that's what he's against.
Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. You're probably right. I'll look at that again.
I'm curious. One of the books I was fascinated by was Eric Kandel's The Age of Insight. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's already years old because he's written other books since, even though he's way older than I am. But some of the fascinating things that he talks about is that in our vision, our receptors are not literally observing everything that's out there. There's instead kind of a computer program that details where the receptors should look for the expected motion that is culturally trained. So we're very efficient that way. We're saving a lot of energy by not trying to immerse ourselves in all this incoming data, but instead we're only looking for the things that we expect. And I think, you know, that's kind of fascinating. If you know that, I suppose the issue is how much are we seeing? At one point, I remember you saying that at those moments when we're not glancing around, that's when we're seeing it all, so to speak. That's not how you said it, but well, you know, the impression I get from what Kandel was talking about, and he's won the Nobel Prize on this, is that it's never the case that we're seeing it all. we're only seeing a portion of it. I don't know if you've ever seen the book, but this is very difficult to share on this kind of a.
Oh, there we go.
The age of insight, which is actually a pun, because it's not just, this is also Freud and others, and the influence on art, and the idea is that the age of insight is when we began to realize that, wow, we're not freely in charge of our experience, that there's things going on that control how our unconscious works, or our subconscious works, or how culture affects how we see the evidence. If you've been watching the trial lately, by the way, that was the defense counselor's argument today, that even the specialists are motivated by a bias. So that's kind of interesting. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And I did write down the title of that book, and I'm going to look into it. Those were, that all sort of relates to like things that I found when I was researching for this, but I didn't, so when I was using those examples of vision, I decided to keep them really narrow, just to like, basically all I was looking for there was evidence that vision is a representation, not a direct perception. But those points are really interesting to me, and I would actually really like to like expand on this further and like turn it into something longer where I can address those things. But yeah, no, thank you for that. That actually, one other thing that does kind of relate to, so for Dr. Potter's class that this paper is for, I'm also presenting on another article, which I think is either coming up this week or next week. And it's about like the neuroscience of free will. And it talks a lot about how like brain activity starts before you necessarily make a conscious decision to do something, which I think is very related to the whole like mechanics of what you choose to see and look at, like your inherent biases. So yeah, no, that's all stuff I'm super interested in.
I love Steven Pinker's comment on that issue though, and he says, but it's my brain. So it's still my free will. Just, I'm not aware of my decision until after my decision has already been made. So
yes, yeah.
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Yes, go for it.
So this is Kevin Krein. I'm actually down in Juneau. I haven't met you, but anyway, excellent presentation. I definitely agree with Eduardo that it's dealing with really complicated and difficult subject matter. One thing I thought, and this is especially if you want to expand it in the future, I mean, I think that the objections to representational theories of cognition and representational theories of mind seemed possibly a bit dated, and I think one of the new, or I guess recently in the last like 15 years or so, people have been really looking at representational theories of mind, or I guess challenging them. One of the big challenges has come from embodied theories of mind or enacted enactivism. So there are people like Evan Thompson, I'm thinking of, who has a specific book on vision and another book called The Embodied Mind. But the idea, and Dan Hutto is another person you might want to look at. But the idea is that rather than that what's happening is, rather than having an actual representation of the world somehow inside your brain. Cognition develops more in terms of interaction with an environment, and so it arises out of the interaction itself. So it's not a challenge to physicalism or anything like that, I mean, in any kind of simple sense, but more the idea is that for various reasons, particularly having to do with just the actual processing power of brains and things like that. So a lot of this comes up in stuff dealing with kind of cognitive science related to sport and stuff like that. But yeah, the idea is that or the challenge is, I guess, is that rather than having an actual representation, it would be much, it seems to be more efficient to function as, using the world itself as a representation, if that makes sense, right? So some of this comes from early robotics and AI stuff where, they used to do the kind of thing where trying to program a machine or to, model, have an internal model of whatever space it was trying to move through and manipulate, but they kind of figured out that, well, if you just focus on programming something that has what it needs to do what it needs to do in its space, it actually, you get further and you can do it with less power. But anyway, that's just the kind of inactive cognition would be a term you might want to look up. And again, that kind of Evan Thompson and Eleanor Rosch would be another person to take a look at in terms of just a different, I would say, fairly serious contemporary challenges to representational theories of mind. And if you want, I'm happy to send you some references too.
Yeah, I would love that actually. Thank you. That would be super helpful. Can I put my email in the chat for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. And then, so like, in terms of, this is actually really helpful because it was sort of hard for me to find things that seemed like valid objections, just because like, I don't know, this class was a little bit of a stretch for me just because it's not like an area of philosophy that I'm super well read in at all. So I did like as compared to other areas. So I kept seeing all these things about like direct theories of perception. I was just like, how is that even an objection? Like that seems so like antiquated. But those are things you brought up are much better objections, I think. So I would love to look into that and like see anything that you have to send me. Thank you. That was really helpful. I cannot see everyone. Let me change.
Scott has his hand up as well. And
perfect.
Before that, Scott, can I totally insert, and if you would mind, I might, along similar lines, actually having to do with the extended mind, you're already familiar a little bit with Merleau-Ponty, and though a different age and a different philosophical context might help fill out kind of the philosophical picture in those kinds of objections and his disappointment with the way in which the mind is conceived. Representation.
Hey, I thought you made kind of a genius argument talking about, because it was really good. Eye tracking demonstrates that human perception is representation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I just wondered if maybe you like kind of tripped on that, or if you dug into that a little bit, the eye tracking.
So that was actually like the first thing, when I figured out that phenomenon was a thing, that was sort of where this whole argument came from.
That's what I kind of thought. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so I guess like the easy way to see it is if you look at yourself in the mirror and you move your eyes, you don't see the movements of your eyes because you only see the next point that you focus on.
Right.
But if you look at someone else's eyes, you do see their movement. And then another way you can, if you look at your own eyes in like a selfie camera on your phone, you do see the eye movement because there's a slight delay from the image being picked up to being displayed on the phone. So it was like, I thought it was like a very intuitive argument that anyone can just go look in the mirror and see for themselves and understand that, like, at least on some very small level, the representation of your visual field is being preserved for a moment.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something there. I was thinking about robots, and do robots really do any eye tracking? You think about like a Tesla that drives itself with the cameras. And I think I might have to use your argument to argue that the car doesn't really have a perception because it's not doing any of this eye tracking. It's not really creating a representation for itself. It's maybe representing something to me, and I'm eye tracking, I'm looking at the road, I'm looking at the screen. But you had also said something in your paper about the moment between the eye tracking.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't get to pick it up quite. Can you recap that? There was something that happens in our consciousness between the time that we're tracking our eyes. I thought you had something there.
Let me go back to that part so I don't like paraphrase it wrong.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking about too. When she said, when your eyes are still, it's like you're seeing everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, everything that's in your visual field, not obviously you can't see what's like behind your head, but otherwise, yes. But so there were, I guess, I'm not sure if this is what you were specifically referring to, but there were a couple parts to that argument about eye movements.
Yeah.
The first is that when your eyes move, you don't see the motion. But the second part was that you also don't experience a jump in focus from one focal point to the next.
Yeah.
That, like, when I was researching it, I got into a lot of like sort of scientific attempts to explain that, and I did not have the ability to go into them in my paper, but I want to get the link to that because if anyone wants to read about it, it was a super interesting paper, and it can like explain that much better than I can. Basically, there are theories of like your brain like remapping the visual representation. It's very interesting.
So there's two parts. You don't see the jump. And what was the second part?
You don't experience so you don't see the movement, i.e. you don't see a blurred perception and you don't perceive your eye movement in a mirror. And the other part was that your perception, your visual field remains stable. It doesn't jump to the next point.
Okay. I'm holding up a Mona Lisa, and she's famous because Da Vinci figured out a way to make her eyes look like no matter where you're standing in the room, she's looking at you. And I thought Scott's issue of I suppose the automated cars that are driving themselves, they have to look around. Their computers are obviously attuned to specific things that they're programmed to watch for. That's a genius argument too, Scott. Thanks for bringing that one up.
Thanks.
But there's Mona Lisa. I don't know. Does she look like she's looking at you? Or I can. Looks like she does. Back when they let me have an office, I would have her on the wall so students could see her. But now they have to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally. It's super interesting. I just sent a link in the chat to the article that I used for most of my citations on the whole eye movement section. And it talks a lot about like other theories of the whole like visual remapping thing. It's super interesting. I only used like the first few pages in my paper because I didn't really have the space to get into the rest, but I definitely recommend it.
Yeah, I think it's a really good argument. I'd love to see it develop more. I mean, you got the 2 points. You don't see the jump, the visual field remains stable, and yet, if it was direct perception, we'd see blurs, we'd be all over the place, So that is, yeah, okay. Thanks for that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Very cool, Scott. The problem to your right is, to your left, is h equals 11 mean the height is 11? You're muted. I couldn't hear it.
Are there any other questions? Although that was a good one, Bill. I know now, Greta, we're all reading the literature that you sent to us.
Oh yeah. It's super interesting. I can't blame you.
I wish I could share refreshments with everyone. Sorry about that.
Yeah, Keldon.
So, Alan Watts makes a kind of cool note that, you know, if you hit a gong, the waves come to your ear and then they dissipate. And he says that reality also comes to us in waves visually, but because our eyes appear static, we don't quite see it that way. Like, vision is actually a dynamic thing, but we think it's static just because we perceive objects, right? I wonder how that works with the mind creating kind of a perception. Because if it really was just waves coming at us, wouldn't it be a blur, like Professor Johnson was saying?
That's super interesting. I think that that makes sense in the context of like light waves on the most like basic level. And I'm sure there's like metaphorical levels too. But that I think is sort of what I was trying to get at with the whole like visual computer thing. Like you get this constant stream of like light waves as visual input, but there's so many processes modulating it, translating it into an electrical signal that your brain can process. The like cells in your retina like adjust themselves. They have like super complex interconnected processes to like make sense of what you're seeing. Then you have like the fact that in your brain, your like the optic nerves, some of the fibers cross over so that you get the like one visual field instead of like two eyeballs. Like there's so many mechanisms that happen on the way to like an actual visual phenomenal perception being created, that I think that is sort of, I don't claim to know the specifics, but I think that process is kind of what accounts for us having like some form of stable representation of the world when like the input is chaos.
That makes sense, because if our eyes are kind of like cameras, right, then it's probably just the stuff on the back end. For sure, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting question, though, about blurring, because with anything using the computer as a model, we can zoom in on very, very tiny fractions of sound and even modulate them with the computer. So clearly it depends on the processing power of the device you're using. And I think everyone agrees that the human mind is way more powerful than any computers we've discovered yet. So yeah, I think when we blur our vision blurs, I think that's a result of the eyes not being focused, essentially. I noticed that with this camera, that I've got, my camera changes focus depending on how I move. And I'm old enough now too that my eyes don't always focus on things the way they used to. So I don't associate the blurriness in my mind and my digital perception as much as with the reception process because of my lenses getting old and so on.
Yeah, no, that's exactly like I guess the most basic or like the first line example of what Keldon was talking about with like the input is chaos and you have to make sense of it somehow. The first way I guess that you do that is by like the lens of your eye focusing the input onto like the focal point at the back of your eye. And so if your eye is, I touched on this but like your eye is shaped like in a not optimal way, if you're nearsighted or farsighted, have astigmatism, that messes with like the initial input of the stimulus. It's not focused as precisely as it should be, and therefore like all the rest of your visual processing has to operate with like a slightly off reception of the input, if that makes sense.
There was a comic the other day that had a shark that had obviously just eaten a scuba diver, and he had taken the mask off of the scuba diver and put it on, and he's talking to one of his friend sharks next to him, and he says, "Hey, I can see underwater now."
Yes, exactly. That's, and yeah, I guess, sorry, this is one last thing I want to mention, I guess. Something that I didn't even mention in my paper that is also like evidence for the whole sort of your brain controlling your perceptions is like, I forget what it was exactly, but like studies have been done where you like impair the use of one eye in an animal, and that eye doesn't develop as strongly as the other eye does because it needs like stimuli to like prompt it to develop, I suppose. So like everything is constantly modulating itself in response to the input or lack thereof that it gets.
Or the extended mind. Taking in another direction. Greta, thank you so much. Wonderful paper.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Great work, each and every one of you. Thank you very much for participating in the conference. This conference has been recorded, and though I talked about Google Drive earlier, I bet there's a more efficient way. Just because, you know, the philosophy department doesn't actually have control over its own webpage doesn't mean that we can't ask others to somehow publicly make our material available. I will find an efficient way to get these materials out. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening to each of you. I hope we can gather again sometime soon.
Is that the end of the conference then, Stephanie? Or?
You know, Bill, it's really never the end for philosophers, but I think it's the end of this particular manifestation of our conversation.
Thanks for this.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for presenting.
Thank you. This was really fun.